All right, Than, we are back after being heavily requested to do this stream. I think I got comment or message at least once a day for the past few weeks. Are you going to respond to Mindshift again?
Really?
All right, fine. Oh. Yeah. All right, we'll do it. Fine. All right, here we go. Here.
Right here. Let's do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we would have done it sooner, but Than needed time. He was busy with real work, and I had to take a break. My wife said I needed a vacation. So
yeah, you were on a vacation, bro. Like,
yeah, I planned for a while, so we went away for a week. It was nice, but yeah. So yeah, we're back. Planned to do the stream, I think, before we left, and yeah, good to go. So all right, so let me just bring everyone up to speed here. Mindshift made a short video arguing God was evil in a response to a 1-minute short I did. We responded to that, and then he brought on Atheist too. I think he's a pretty cool guy. I have respect for him. Michael Beverly. Same goes for Mindshift. I don't have any animosity towards these guys either. But yeah. They did a longer response to many of the points we brought up, and yeah, I'm happy to do another stream responding to them again because I get a lot of messages from people saying like, "Hey, I like the streams. It's teaching me how to think. It's teaching me how to respond to this kind of stuff. Just going through the atheist arguments or the Muslim arguments and just responding is helping me learn how to do this myself." So we're going to keep doing more streams like this because I find that people go through them and they actually learn a lot just learning how to respond to them. So that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be going through Mindshift and Michael Beverly's video, responding to their points. We're not going to respond to everything. Obviously, we made notes on where to skip ahead at some points so we don't get repetitive. But yeah, so what were your thoughts with the overall video, Than?
So I'll echo this. I don't think Brandon's a good guy, and I like Michael. Him and I.
Wait, you don't think Brandon's a good guy?
I mean, a bad guy.
Yeah, I heard that, and I was like, I better fix that.
You know what I meant. Michael's cool too. Beverly and I have been emailing back and forth. I'm actually going to be on Beverly's channel for a chat on New Testament reliability at some point. Mm-hmm. We had to reschedule just because I got so much going on right now. But I'll say this: I just thought I was really disappointed at the end of the day, just because there was a lot of points where I felt like there was just a bunch of armchair psychology happening. Yep. And then instead of actual objections to the arguments and positions we're putting up, we're just kind of being told we're making excuses and being psychologized and not really putting up with the arguments and the data and the positions we have. So, well, that's I'm
going to consider that a win when atheists like Paulo Gia or anyone else says our arguments are just excuses. Because, I mean, when you just respond to arguments and call them excuses, it's just a form of mockery. And all this shows you can't really respond to what we have to say. So you have to like propagandize it. Maybe that's not the right word to call them excuses for your audience. Look, just respond to our argument. I could go through atheist videos and say, well, this is just an excuse to rescue your ideas so you can just sin and reject God. That would be horrible for me to do. I'm not going to call all of the atheist arguments excuses. I'm going to respond. I'm going to try to steelman them, even though I'm not going to be perfect at it. If you're just going to call our arguments excuses at the end of the day, I'm going to start considering that a win because it tells me you can't respond to them. So you got to like characterize them in a different way so you don't think you have to. And I think that's really unfortunate. The other thing I would say is that a lot of what they present reveals that they are not familiar with a lot of the literature. So when we get to some sociology aspects where Michael, I'm going to call him Beverly so people don't confuse him with me. Yeah. When Beverly gets to ideas about Christianity, things in Joshua leading to war. Okay, we're going to go over some sociology there to see if Christianity really does lead to violence and war. And we were talking earlier about the virtue ethics aspect. It just really felt like they were just not familiar with a lot of the literature, unfortunately, around this topic.
Yeah, that reminds me of another point I wanted to make, which was if you watch their video, and I don't mean this in an insulting way, but I just felt like there was just so many philosophical blunders that happened during their response to us. And I think the problem is like you have to understand how dialectics move back and forth, how different theories and different hypotheses have to, like, you have a data point for this hypothesis, and you have to deal with those data points and then give counters. You can't just like blow something off and hand wave it away by calling it an excuse or calling it an ad hoc or anything like that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, long story short, I think there was a lot of philosophical blunders that happened during this response. So,
yeah. All right, well, let's get into it. Let's not waste time. There's a lot to go through here. And so again, yeah, I think these are pretty good for teaching people how to respond to these types of arguments. We'll take some breaks momentarily and get to your super chats here. So just keep those flowing in. They will get saved and we will respond to them. So we're going to start early in here. So let's play a little bit and see what happens.
That's the whole point. Anything you want to add there?
Well, yes. One of the things that Christian apologists often do is they'll make a statement like, well, the apostles all were willing to be martyred, and who would do that for a lie?
Well, I need to go back a little bit here because I think I wanted to get Brandon's point in there. So I'm going to start at 3 minutes.
Video response, giving a lot of examples where I think God is clearly prescribing evil or immoral acts. You know, he says, oh, we call out that God is evil over and over and over. The whole point of the video is not that God is evil. We don't believe in God. The point of the video is that the God of the Bible, as it's written, is inconsistent with what is deemed evil or not. That's the whole point.
Okay, good. There's the point I wanted to play there. So we are getting confirmation now that what the argument that they're making is an internal critique. They don't believe in God. Fair enough. But now I'm going to hold their feet to the fire on that. If they're making an internal critique, when you make an internal critique, it's like you step into the Christian worldview, you assume it's true for the sake of argument, and then you try to show inconsistencies there. So like you say God is the basis for good, but here he does something immoral. There's a contradiction in your worldview. That's a problem. So they're making an internal critique. All right. I'm going to hold your feet to the fire on that because sometimes you guys step out of that a little bit later on. So anything you want to add there?
Yeah, the only thing I'll add in here is later on in the video, they actually go outside of that external critique again. And Beverly will even say, like, as the atheist, this is what I think is going on. And this is evidence for that. But putting that aside, when it comes to internal critiques, you said you have to enter into the Christian worldview. But then the other thing that you have to do is you have to operate within the specific Christian, like the specific beliefs of Christianity of the person you're talking to, right?
Yeah.
So in other words, you can't just assume what the Christian worldview means and how to interpret different passages and all this stuff, and then bring that baggage into the internal critique for the specific person you're talking to. So a very simple way of putting it would just be like, if Brandon thinks Christianity is Calvinistic intrinsically or something like that, if he thinks that's the best interpretation, he can't come to an Arminian and be like, this is how you're supposed to interpret these passages, and here's the inconsistency. Right. You have to adopt the worldview that the person you're talking to has.
Yeah. Yeah. And also, I want to say I'm really upset that Michael's last name is Beverly, because every time I hear you say Beverly, my mind wants to finish the Weezer song. That's where I wanna. So, yeah. Really unfortunate that's now stuck in my head now. So,
do we need to play it to get it out?
No, well, not with copyright issues. We're not playing it.
Oh, that's fair. That's fair.
Anything you want to add there?
Well, yes. One of the things that Christian apologists often do is they'll make a statement like, well, the apostles all were willing to be martyred, and who would do that for a lie? And there's 12 of them. And then so that this is like a 10-second thing. And on the Christian side, they'll just accept it. Yeah, this is what happened. So Christianity is true. The problem with the response to that, if you don't dive into the actual details and get everything out there to respond, you'll be dismissed. So a 10 or 15-second clip can easily take an hour response to genuinely dive in. And I think that's what you were trying to do. And I think that this idea, considering they also took your short, whatever, your 20 or 30-minute video and made a 2-hour video out of it.
Yeah.
Well, why? Because you need time. So I think that's an unfair and an uncharitable complaint. He says,
and I don't think I was complaining. I think my point was that he sort of missed the point of the video. Like it was, I'm not saying that you can't do that. I'm just saying, like, please just try to represent what I said fairly. Like that was the whole point I think I was trying to make. If I misspoke and did that, I apologize, but I don't think that's what I was trying to get at. So I just want to clarify that. In his opening of his video, that he's going to agree. He's not just going to go to descriptions. He's going to go to actual prescriptions, and then he doesn't. And then he just goes to more descriptions. And it's like, dude, I thought you said you were going to actually offer some criticism here. You just do exactly what you said you weren't going to do, which is just show us more descriptions of evil in the Bible and assume God endorsed it.
Yeah, that's the first thing I noticed as I was listening to the video. It seems like he starts the video by saying, we're going to go through a lot of places where God actually prescribes evil. And then the overwhelming majority of these are just descriptions. And he adds in, well, God didn't actually say this was bad, so therefore this must be a prescription. It seems at least like that's what's going on.
This is so silly to me that this was said, and they actually double down on this at the end, and I'll play that here, where they've gone through the entire video. They obviously watched it before they started, and yet they say I make little to almost no, and they actually say none at the end, prescriptions, no examples of that. The very first thing that I show, and we'll get to it with the example of Abraham, is a prescription from God to have Abraham follow his wife Sarah's advice to exile Hagar. And then I give a whole bunch of context. And in giving that context, this is where Than is making this point of, oh, he just talks about all these things that happen that God doesn't say anything about and thus must condone. And I do make those points. And so, the first thing I want to do is just address, I said I was going to make a video of prescriptions. I made a video of prescriptions, and I also included a ton of descriptions. So that's on me. I could have made a 10-minute video. Here's 10 prescriptions, 1 minute per prescription. But I do think that I not only wanted to reply to the original issue of God doesn't ever prescribe evil, but I also wanted to show that we shouldn't just let off the hook all of the neutral times where God blesses or allows or doesn't say anything about certain behavior, because I think there is still a point to be made there. And Michael,
all right, let's stop there and take a look. So yeah, I'm kind of confused about what he says here, because he kind of admits, he says like, that was on me. I include a lot of descriptions. Okay, but then like, what's wrong with us calling that out? And also, like the whole neutral aspect, the neutral times when, God doesn't, again, if this is an internal critique, all we have to do is provide reasonable defeaters in a philosophical sense to show that, we should have the presumption of innocence. Okay. We don't consider someone guilty for having a neutral stance on something. Okay. So like there's things to also consider in that, which we'll get into this more later, like God's foreknowledge. He may be staying out because he understands a better result will come out of that when he's working with human free will. Okay. Acts 17:30 even sort of hints to this when it says God overlooked in the times of ignorance, God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. So even in Acts 17:30, we see God suggesting this idea that he has overlooked things in the past to bring about a better purpose ultimately, which was Christ, the new covenant. And now he's calling all people to him, this kind of thing. So there's a lot of things to consider there. And the main point I want to get at, though, is if you have a neutral argument, what happened to the presumption of innocence? You're innocent until proven guilty. Why do the neutral stance? Why is that evidence that God is somehow evil, especially if we factor in foreknowledge? What are your thoughts?
I agree with everything you're saying. The other thing that and I'm picking up on this throughout the video, and I'll bring this up a little bit later, but one thing will be, I feel like we're playing a little fast and loose with the term prescription throughout this video. Because like, it seems like what Brandon wants to say, something along the lines of like, God is prescribing something if it's the case that he's saying, go do this, and he has some X reasons for doing it. And it seems like you and I are taking the word prescription to be some sort of like ethical normative notion.
Right.
And I think there's a miscommunication happening there. I'm not really sure yet, to be honest with you. I wish this is one of those times where I wish I could like text Brandon and be like, what you thinking? But
well,
that's one of the things I'm picking up on.
Yeah, if it's a prescription, it's got to be, I think that just the understanding of it's got to be in a normative sense. Like God is telling you to go do something. I don't know. I feel like there just wasn't a lot. And we did address the ones. I'm not saying that Brandon didn't bring up any. He clearly brought up some, and we responded to those. So yeah. All right, let's truck along here.
Well, I'll let you get the first word on some of these, but that one was important to me.
Yeah, he plays a lot with ambiguity. Now, there are some legitimate concerns. That's why we're addressing this. Mm-hmm. It's not like he doesn't make any, it's not like his arguments are all bad. Some of them miss the mark. But, I mean, a lot of what he brings up, he just sort of plays with ambiguities. And so before we even get into it, there's a lot of presuppositions that need to be established. Like, for example, and sometimes in the video, he's mad that God doesn't punish Abraham or Jacob. But then he's mad that God punishes the Canaanites for their sin later. Like, we see this kind of like attitude where it's like, if God punishes someone, well, that's bad. If God doesn't punish someone, well, that's also bad. It's a lose-lose. There's a lot of appeals to emotion in this video, which is not a valid argument. At one point, he even says, I'm going to pull on the strings of your heart. Dude, like that's an argument from an emotion at that point. So it's not a valid argument at that point. We need to look at this logically.
Well, so this is an interesting thing. All of these apologetics appeal to emotion, and we're emotional beings. So I do understand what Michael is saying, that you can't just argue from emotion. And if you had only done that, then your argument wouldn't be valid logically. But just because you're being emotional about it and appealing to people's emotions, it's an appeal to people's empathy. And yes, there needs to be logic and reason and so forth. But I think this criticism is kind of unfair because they also do the same thing. And we also have to recognize all of us are looking at this through the lens of our personal bias and our personal feelings, and we all come into it with feelings about it. So
I agree with what Michael is saying there, or Beverly is saying there. No issue there. Again, my point was not that you can't be emotional. It's that don't say like God is evil because this is emotional or this upsets me. So just real quick, wanted to address that.
I think that's it's a little bit of poisoning the well, I think, is what's happening in the beginning of this.
Yeah, I agree. And
No, that would not be poisoning the well, because we're not saying things like, well, you can't trust these guys because they're not scholars or they don't have degrees or this kind of stuff.
They're making excuses.
Yeah. And poisoning the well is where you'd be like, don't trust them. They're biased. They're apologists. They just want this stuff. It's a specific appeal to character aspects.
Yeah.
Critiquing their arguments is not poisoning the well. That's what you're supposed to do. Like,
Yeah.
You just can't accuse someone of poisoning the well for doing what you're supposed to. So I don't know.
And I think you explained it well. And there was a first part that was said there too, that, well, he's upset with God for not punishing, say, Abraham or Jacob, but then he's upset at God's punishment for Canaan. I'm not upset that Abraham doesn't get punished. I'm upset at the inconsistency, because this is what we're trying to establish, that there is objective moral standard from God. And also,
all right, so we sort of addressed this pretty at length, so we'll touch on this really quickly. There isn't an inconsistency. So God has a right to punish any sinful creature whenever he wants. He's merciful, though, and doesn't do that. He's only punishing when it's going to affect his plan. So he's going to bring about this plan of salvation, which will bring about the eschaton. And when people are getting in the way because of sin, then he's going to punish because he wants to bring about a better result. And Brandon even said this last time, that God is only punishing people when it's affecting his plan or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's not an inconsistency. That's actually showing that God is typically merciful, but he wants to bring about this plan. Don't get in his way, because he's trying to do a good for humanity here, kind of thing. So I don't know. Anything you want to add there?
Yeah. Again, we hit this at length in the last stream. So again, like, there's only an inconsistency if you force it with some presupposition about like a really, really, really strict deontological ethic that has no like moral hierarchy or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Let me play a little bit more, and then I'm going to put some slides up, because we're going to start getting into some of the literature.
Also, the punishment for Canaan was total destruction, annihilation, genocide. I wasn't saying Abraham needs to be genocided. I'm saying the clear showing that God is not punishing Abraham and is in fact endorsing what we would consider immoral behavior from Abraham, and that you then would have the same God who would punish so extremely the Canaanites, I think is the point that is trying to be made. And so all
right, that's where I want to get to. Okay, so we're assuming genocide here. Okay, again, there's a lot of literature on this. I want to put up some slides so you can kind of see that that's not what's going on in the conquest account here. So, all right, so here are my slides. So when it talks about total destruction, the word is haram. Haram does not mean destroy. It means remove from use. So we can see this in certain places. So God is not saying go genocide the Canaanites. Okay, so for example, in Leviticus 17:21, but the field, when it is released in the Jubilee, shall be a holy gift to the Lord, like a field that has been devoted. Haram, not destroyed. They're not going to destroy it. The priest shall be in possession of it. Every devoted thing, haram, in Israel shall be yours. So what do they say? They say that the Hivites, the Perizzites, the Girgashites, and so on, does not refer to each and every person of those particular ethnicities individually. It refers to the community in which they participate, from which they draw their identity. So what does it mean to haram an identity? If haram means remove from use, then removing an identity from use depends on what identity is used for. We suggest that the action is comparable to what we might try to accomplish by disbanding an organization. Doing so does not typically entail disposing of all the members, but it means that nobody is able to say, I am a member of X anymore. After World War II, when the Allies destroyed the Third Reich, they did not kill every individual German soldier and citizen. They killed the leader specifically and deliberately, compared to the litany of kings put to the sword in Joshua 10:13, and also burned the flags, toppled the monuments, dismantled the government and chain of command, disarmed the military, occupied the cities, banned the symbols, vilified the ideology, and persecuted any attempt to resurrect it. But most of the people were left alone, and most of those who weren't casualties of war. This is what it means to haram an identity. The terror that goes before Israel, the Israelite army, okay, he's probably intending to encourage them to flee rather than fight, or at least to run away early than the otherwise might. Nowhere in the conquest account does the army systematically hunt down fleeing refugees. Nowhere are urban cities trapped in protracted sieges, because the land is haram. Israel cannot make use of it for itself, but it belongs to God, and so God can do whatever he wants with it. Sorry for the typos. Getting them out myself. So what does this all mean? Okay, God is not saying the Canaanites have to be literally like genocided. Okay, I know that term is thrown around a lot. I totally reject it. I don't think that's a fair comparison. Okay. What Walton and Walton, so Walton and his son, are saying is they point out, they are to haram the lands and objects and remove from human use. Then God leases them back to Israel. So basically these identities, these sinful identities where they were committing child sacrifice, they're haram. Get rid of them. Those identities need to go away. It's kind of like the identity of the Nazis. Get rid of it, needs to go away kind of thing. This is not literally saying kill every man, woman, and child, literally like wipe out all the inhabitants. And again, this correlates with the text because we see in Judges, there's many Canaanites still there. Even at the end of Joshua, there's still many Canaanites still there, as we added last time. So again, the punishments, I wanted to address this early because I know they're going to bring this up more, but again, this goes back to my main point. God is able to punish the Canaanites for their obviously evil sin. But I mean, again, they're trying to make it this extreme when it's just, again, that's not really, I don't think that's really what the scholarship is. And I could cite more books. I just cited one for time's sake, but there's a lot more I could cite. Anything you want to add before we move on?
No, we addressed a lot more stuff in the previous stream, and they didn't really offer any rebuttals to the things we did bring up. So
yeah, I mean, we played a clip from Richard Hess talking about Joshua 6, about how that's in stereotypical language. Just say everyone inside died, not that there were little children inside a fort called Jericho. So a lot of stuff like that. All right, let's play it about another minute or so.
if you're playing it, you only got the slides up right now.
Oh, my bad. Sorry about that. I know what I did wrong. I've just hit the video and I still have my slides up. All right. It's the problem of live streams. We have issues like that. All right. Here we go. Let's see.
And so for them to say he's playing with ambiguity and has unfair and hypocritical expectations of this God, this is not the point at all. And the last thing I'll say for the emotional thing, because I did come out and say it, and I knew someone was going to say it, and of course it was like, oh, when I say I want to tug on your heartstrings, the other thing is when I was a Christian, I excused so much of what I read in the Bible because it was old. Oh, but it was different back then. Oh, you know, I couldn't connect myself to the Canaanites. They must have been evil. They must have just been terrible people. God is sovereign. You know, this is fine. But when I had kids and things did become more emotional to me, and I saw how innocent they are despite anything of myself, then when you start hearing about men, women, and children being wiped out, even of evil men's doing, you can't make excuses for it anymore. And so when I take the time to paint a picture of that these were real people, so the story goes, and that there would have been actual women and children being stabbed or harmed, and I do this to pull on your heartstring, it's so that people like me who were stuck in this, oh, it's old, it doesn't matter, it's not real, they can bridge that gap a little more. It is a logical.
Okay, but that's, I mean, the comparison with your own kids, I don't think is a good analogy, because if we're doing an internal critique again, you're entering the Bible, and what is God accusing the Canaanites of? Child sacrifice. Listen, if there was a group of Christians that believe that they should perform child sacrifice, I mean, I would join with any group who wanted to raid in and rescue the children and put them to death. I mean, because like, that's evil. I mean, if this is an internal critique, you're attacking what the Bible says. These Canaanites were doing horrible things. Those identities needed to be harammed, wiped out. And again, there's no evidence women and children were targeted. Richard Hess talks about this, that Jericho was like a fort. When this sort of thing happens, the civilians flee into the countryside and the men stay back and defend the fort, kind of thing. So no evidence of that. Anything you want to add?
Not here.
All right. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here since, again, I don't want to just play points we've already responded to. They say a lot of the same stuff over and over again. We're just going to try to hit the main points here. So
essentially arguing, for instance, in World War II, not everybody was genocided, so it's not so bad. That essentially their argument is these things that God ordered directly, and they are going to admit in several cases that Moses was wrong and he's the bad guy. Well, saying that, oh, they didn't kill everybody, that's an exaggeration. That doesn't get you off the hook unless your argument is, well, you got to kill 51% of people for it to be a real genocide and to be terrible. No.
All right, real quick. He made the analogy to World War II. Fan, anything you want to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, like, well, the first thing we're just going to say is notice he said, well, not everybody was genocided, as if like, I don't know if Beverly's understanding the point we're trying to make here, because we're not saying 51% of the population was attacked, or we're just, the argument is not, hey, it was only a little bit of genocide, so it was okay. The argument is you're just misinterpreting the text just completely.
Yeah.
This is what's going on. Then we're not stopping there either. Like, that's just one piece of the puzzle we might point to.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, and like again, I think he's talking about. So if I'm gonna, I think when he's talking about World War II, he's talking about what the Nazis did. Again, but Walton used the analogy on the other side, like what the Allies did. They compare what the Allies did to Joshua's conquest. They go in, they destroy the ideology, and they didn't commit genocide, but they executed like the leading Nazi members for their horrible, evil actions, and no one I think would disagree with that. If you do, I have some questions, but like, so they did that same kind of thing. And you see in the text of Joshua, it's like, they know like God is with Israel. So again, internal critique. So what does Joshua say? Rahab says like, we know what all these miracles God has done for you. So that's why I'm joining with you guys. And then when they cross the Jordan and the kings of the Amorites here, they tremble, but they still go out and fight Israel anyway. So it's like, they had clear signs that they were about to get attacked by a superior force because they had God with them, and they still stayed and fought. So, there's a lot of context here that needs to be considered.
Oh, Michael Jones, if you kill 5% or even 1% of the women and children, or even one, in my opinion, that's bad. If an all-powerful
Agreed.
God is either ordering it directly or putting a warlord or a war leader in charge of this destruction, the argument that it's hyperbole that everyone was killed is not about. It doesn't get you off the hook unless you're excusing a little bit of murder of women and children and non-combatants as being okay. And I'm not sure why they make that argument, because it seems like it undercuts their entire point. Unless they're willing to say, if you kill a few innocent people on purpose, that's acceptable.
Yeah. No, well.
All right. Anything you want to say on that?
I feel like we've already addressed that point again, because we've already made the point that women and children were not considered combatants and targets.
Yeah. And again, we're trying to interpret the text in their cultural context to best understand the text. I mean, we put up a bunch of slides last time of similar hyperbolic language, hagiographic hyperbole, as I believe the term is used in book by like K. Lawson Younger Jr.'s book, for example, of like, this is just how you spoke about war conquest or battles in the ancient Near East. We wiped everyone out. We left none alive. And then the remnant ran away. Like, what do you mean the remnant went away? I mean, you just said you wiped out everyone.
Yeah, exactly.
No, that's how they talk. So no, we're not. So I don't know. We've already hit that. Let's continue on.
Well said. I won't go on. You covered so much of what I would have said. The only thing I would add is we don't only play with ambiguity. I do point out the neutral times, or the times where we're unsure of God's stance on it, and thus the allowance could look like this. But it's not the only thing that I do. And they focus more on that than most of the prescriptions that I do give. It almost feels like, because I gave them this material that is vague, and to their mind, as long as they can come up with one more charitable defeater, it eradicates that point, which I also just disagree with. I mean,
okay, well, why? If you're doing an internal critique and we provide defeaters and we have the presumption of innocence and the principle of charity, what's the problem here? I mean, that's just basic philosophy. I've read entire papers about philosophical defeaters of people defending their own views in like ethics or epistemology, and they just provide a defeater and everyone agrees, okay, they got a defeater, move on. Kind of like, this is, I mean, I don't know, Than. That's just like basic philosophy. I don't see why that would be wrong.
That happens a lot in this video, I feel like, where just like a basic philosophical point comes up, and then they'll just be like, well, I just disagree, but then not tell us why they disagree or give us some sort of philosophical justification for their disagreement or anything like that. And that's a big part of my disappointment in this response.
Yeah, totally agree with you there.
I mean, it's starting from a presupposition, if you're talking about that God is perfectly good. And so if there's a way to see this as better or good or more morally justified, then it excuses everything else entirely. Well, maybe to God and the Jews, but not to the countering sides, which is right. A point that we talk about. So again, I'm so excited to get into the examples because I actually couldn't believe.
All right, real quick. I mean, again, anything you want to say there? I think we've already hit those points.
I'll just really quick say, that's another rhetorical move I've seen a lot from atheists on YouTube, atheists and internet atheists, calling stuff presuppositions. The problem is, if you're going to come in with an internal critique, it's not a presupposition, right? That's just you're dealing with the worldview we have. Part of the worldview we have is that we have a perfectly good God. Deal with the worldview,
right? The whole worldview.
And even if it was an external critique, if I just have this hypothesis, right? People seem to conflate presuppositions with hypotheses a lot too, and that's just not what's going on. This is correct. Again, philosophy 101.
All right, let's continue on here, and then I'll get to some super chats after the next time we stop.
believe some of the excuses that were made. So I know we're spending a lot of time up front here, but I think this is good. I think we're really setting the stage of the
real quick. Again, if you're going to call everything we're saying excuses, that's from now on, because I've heard atheists do this so much. I'm just going to say that's just a caricature, because you can't respond to the arguments. Respond to the arguments. Okay. They're not excuses. If you want to call them that, I'm going to consider that a victory from now on.
the differences and the level of fairness going into these critiques.
Throughout the video, it seems like he was just kind of nitpicking some anticipated responses that not every Christian is going to give. He kind of anticipated objections from Christians that people typically won't give unless they're like on the way hyper-literalist camp or something like that. There's types of responses that the church has been giving for a really long time, like progressive revelation and like redemptive movement ethic hermeneutics and stuff like that. And I was telling you this off screen, but another thing I just think is like some philosophical issues where it seems like he just presumes the Bible like teaches a really strict deontological ethic rather than like a type of virtue ethic, and he used to like fabricate contradictions. So those are some of my preliminaries.
So I'll start, and then I'll have you maybe address the second point. I understand what they're saying. I think it works against them because the issue is so many Christians have so many different theologies and ideas about what the Bible is or isn't, what it says or how it says it, how seriously to take it, virtue ethics versus not, which by the way, the virtue ethics really don't come into the New Testament. Almost everything we're talking about here is exclusively Old Testament. You know, you can argue, of course, from their end, oh, it's the same God, therefore it's still virtue ethics in the Old Testament, except that's not what we see. We see direct law, and we see direct laws being broken. We see harsh sentences for that. But what's so...
All right, let's talk about that real quick. I mean, no, see, virtue ethics definitely comes in prior to Aristotle. I mean, even though it's not as formalized, you definitely see the principles in Proverbs, for example. I mean, like that's one of my main go-to books if I'm going to argue that like there's virtue ethics in the Bible. I left it out of my video on virtue ethics. I think it was just focusing on the New Testament back then, but Proverbs is very clearly at least in the virtue ethical framework, even though it comes before that's been formalized kind of stuff. But yeah, like, what do you have to say? I'm going to put up a couple slides up here.
Nothing at the moment, really. It's you kind of hit it on the head, and I think you're probably going to start talking about what laws are. Yeah.
So real quick, again, as we noted, you know, K. Lawson Jr. notes like there's just a hyperbolic nature of the account of Joshua here. I mean, it's not this idea they have to literally wipe out every single soul. That's just not what they're saying. But when it comes to the Mosaic law, it's not a law. I'm going to hit this. I've hit this so many times, but it's a treatise on judicial wisdom. No one read the Code of Hammurabi and was like, aha, here are the laws of Hammurabi. That's not what happened. They read them as like, oh, he's showing us how wise he is. His treatise on judicial wisdom. So Dilbert Hiller says there is no evidence that any collection of Near Eastern laws function as a written code that was applied by a strict method of exegesis to individual cases. As far as we can tell, these bodies of laws served educational purposes and gave expression to what was regarded as just in typical cases, but they left considerable latitude to local courts for determining the right in individual suits. They aided local courts without controlling them. Another quote here, we got John Walton. He says this: the current view is that the collection of legal sayings in the ancient Near Eastern documents constitutes expressions of legal wisdom assembled under the king's sponsorship and attributed to him to provide evidence of his wisdom and justice. These are not laws that have been enacted, nor necessarily rulings that have actually been given. They are treatises on judicial wisdom. They're like Proverbs, except talking about justice, not even ethics really per se. So you read Proverbs to understand how to be moral. You could find some commands in there, but a lot of it is just sort of explaining how you should think about morality. That's virtue ethics right there, baby. You're trying to learn what the virtues are so you can eventually act them out. That's what Proverbs is kind of doing. The Torah is doing that, but with justice in the ancient Near East, not universal justice. So what would justice look like among those cultures in that time? So like today, we have laws regulating gambling, even though we would say gambling would be nice if it didn't exist. We have laws regulating divorce, even though it would be nice if divorce didn't exist. You have laws, you have it's treatises. The Torah is a treatise telling you how to think about justice, how to respond to certain situations in that culture. As Walton says in one of his lectures, the point of it is how were they to be a light to the nations around them? What could they do? How should they present what justice should look like? So those surrounding nations would see the glory of God, kind of thing. So it's not a moral law for all people in all times. It's not even really a law code of Israel. That's really just not how it was thought. So, I mean, I think I even heard Josh Bell, and Nikki, correct me if I'm wrong, say that he didn't really even think that this was a law code. So I mean, like, yeah, I know some Christians try to do that view, and I have scolded them, and I've even messaged them privately, like, stop doing that. Like, this is not what this is. Like, seriously.
Yeah. No, 100%.
Anything you want to add there?
No, I was just the only other thing I was going to add is like a huge chunk of the Torah is not just like it's not even just what we covered, but it's also going to be things that are talking about like these are going to be customs for ancient Jewish identity, for instance. And like that's part of the reason why there was like a debate in the New Testament times about whether or not like a Gentile should be following the Torah and stuff like that. So there's so much to the Torah scholarship that I think there's so much missing here when they brought these points up.
So this is not evidence God is evil, because again, we have to study it in its cultural context and try to get what God was saying. So,
yeah.
All right. Thank you for becoming a member, Jason. Much appreciated. Thank you for the super chat. Under a monarchical Trinity, if the Son doesn't have a deity like the Father, how does he share in the same divine essence? How is he not a subordinate? Good question. So Joshua Sijawati answers this. He says that the Father, Son, and Spirit share all intrinsic properties. Aseity is an extrinsic property because it's only defined in relation to other things outside of yourself. So it's not an intrinsic property. So the Father, Son, and Spirit still share all intrinsic properties. And the Father has aseity, which is an extrinsic property. So that's how I would answer that. Love your work. It has really helped me. I wanted to ask you guys, what are your thoughts on God commanding the Israelites to fight the Canaanites rather than doing it himself? Thanks. What are your thoughts on that, Fan?
If you actually read a really good book to read on this would be what's it called? Flood and Fury by
I got that book.
Matthew Lynch. And you'll actually notice some really interesting themes that he brings up where like, yeah, the Israelites didn't engage in some physical combat probably and all this other stuff, but a lot of the times that they're talking about their victories, they're actually attributing their victories to God. So I don't know that the question assumes something that's not really the case, which is that God didn't interact with this war at all.
I think we'd also that God is a relational being. He wants to work with people to bring about his plan. He wrestles with Jacob. He calls us to do the Great Commission as his body. God could just do everything he wants, but this is about building relationships and working with humans. That's why we're his image bearers. We are called to make the world a better place. He does it through us. So God's ultimate goal is to have loving relationships with his creatures. He can't do that if he's just always doing everything for us because he's a God, not a nanny. So that's what I would say. You mentioned the Canaanites, but how would you respond when someone brings up specifically the Amorites, number 21, and the Midianites, numbers 31? Well, we responded about the Midianites last time and said this was Moses acting on his own. And again, it's a lot of the same ancient Near Eastern war hyperbole, I would say. I don't think it changes from Canaanites to Amorites. It's the same concept there.
Yeah, and one of my go-to books to recommend on this, if you want to like really dig into the scholarship on this topic, Bloody, Brutal, and Barbaric by I don't remember his name off the top of my head. Shoot. Yeah. But it's a good book.
All right. Well, you failed. If the Torah was a treatise, why were they bloodthirsty to kill Jesus? Great question. It's because it later gets reinterpreted by the Jews in that time to be something more like a law. And this is one of the things Jesus is constantly correcting them on. You search the scriptures thinking it'll give you eternal life. You have failed to see it has been pointing to me. He says that in John 5:39. He constantly is saying, you've got this wrong. Like Sabbath isn't like this strict law that you always have to kill people for. Like, that's not what it is. The Sabbath was made for man. Man wasn't made for the Sabbath kind of thing. He's trying to point out to them, they have got this wrong in so many ways. So even with Matthew 19, like you were given the law of divorce because your hearts were hard. Okay. That was not the point of it, so things like that.
I remember the names. It was a William Webb and Gordon Oast.
Yeah. All right. That's virtue ethics right there, baby. Merch line. Yeah. I gotta do something about that eventually.
You gotta get some merch going.
Yeah, I know. And it's just time and, I don't like being a salesman, but I
just gonna scream at Matt.
Matt, get merch going, Matt. Come on, Matt. That's my social media helper. All right, let's get the video back up here and we'll get to more super chats a little later. Let me see. All right, yeah, let's play a little bit more here.
So funny, and just keep this in mind, is many of the arguments they're going to make back in excuses are exactly the kinds of things that I bring up in my preconceived objections. So I'll leave it to you, but I just think you can't please all Christians because all Christians don't agree. That's the problem.
Yeah, well, this really undercuts their position that they have the right interpretation and the right prompting of the Holy Spirit. Let's grant that Than and Michael are in the camp of that small percentage of Christians that have the right interpretation and the Holy Spirit is guiding them. If we grant that for the sake of argument, okay. But what that means is 90% of self-professed Christians are not really Christians. They're reading the Bible wrong, and the Holy Spirit that they feel is wrong. So if Michael and Than want to land on that position as atheists, we'll say, guess what, guys? We agree with you 100%. Those other Christians don't have the right interpretation and they don't have the Holy Spirit, but your claim that you do seems very, very specious. Like, why should we trust you when we can get 1,000 other Christians to say you're wrong?
That's right, folks. If you're not a Christian unless you agree with me on 100% of everything. That's exactly what we're saying. What?
We never appeal to the Holy Spirit. Like,
no.
I was shocked. I was shocked when this was said.
I know. Like, okay, first of all, where to begin? I'm more of a Molinist. I'm not saying Calvinists are damned or they don't have the Holy Spirit because we have theological disagreements. We also don't think we do hermeneutics through the Holy Spirit. That's not how it works. Like, that's never been how it works. Like Acts 17, the Bereans searched the scriptures to see that Paul was right. They didn't just pray for the Holy Spirit to tell them what to think. Like, we're not saying that if other Christians disagree with us, they're not real Christians. They don't have the Holy Spirit. And again, the original Mindshift video was a response to me. I feel like you should take the views that we espouse as sort of just the baseline. Like, I'm at a loss for words. That was just like a total miss right there.
So Beverly's probably just saying maybe he thinks like that's a standard Christian view, that the Holy Spirit is the role of the Holy Spirit is to help with hermeneutics and doing hardcore theology and all this other stuff. But that's a really new thing in some charismatic circles.
Yeah.
Ben Stanhope has a really interesting video on this topic titled like the Holy Spirit is not your Bible commentary. I highly recommend people watch that. It's a really good video. And then one last thing I'll just say here is I don't know if Beverly wants to really point to that heuristic, which was that, hey, if you're part of this subgroup but you disagree with other people in that subgroup, well, that just makes your position really suspect, right? Because that's just going to have some really bad counterexamples, because he's an atheist. Him and Brandon disagree with each other. They're both atheists. So does that mean that they're both suspect, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, different, if you're within the realm of biblical scholars and biblical scholars disagree with each other on all these different fronts. So it's like, okay, so should we not agree with all these biblical scholars then? There's so much.
And again, at the end of the day, all we can do is offer what we think is the most likely explanation. Like, what do you want from us? We can't literally just give a survey of everyone else's view. Like,
yeah.
All right. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here and let's continue on.
Cool.
These scriptures, these commandments, and these stories were written by men. And what we point out is the fact that they do things that we all recognize as being evil and completely unacceptable in modern times in the societies we live in today undercuts, and we use this as evidence that this God does not exist. Our argument continues. If this all-loving, all-knowing God existed back then, what he should have done is given them good rules to live in a way that's loving and kind and merciful. Either the God that they describe doesn't exist, like we claim, or if this God does exist, then yes, we don't need to critique it from some outside objective thing. We can critique it from their own literature, including the New Testament, and say, look, on your own arguments about loving kindness, this God described is not. So if this God exists, he must be either sadistic or cruel or malicious or some other thing other than what you're describing, because you have to continually excuse these things for some purpose that's outside of our understanding. And that excuse, of course, can excuse away anything. And it has.
All right. Before we get to some of the sociological stuff. So why didn't God give them good rules? Well, he tried and they rejected them. This is what Jesus says in Matthew 19. You were given the law of divorce because your hearts were hard, but that's not what God actually wanted. Okay. He didn't want that, but so I mean, even if God could have given them really good law, who is to say they could have kept them perfectly? I used this analogy last time. When the British went into India, they got rid of child marriage slowly. They first outlawed marriage under the age of 12, and the Hindus and Muslims rioted. Okay. They tried to get rid of widow burning, and they did, but they had to do it by force because Hindus didn't want to give that up. Okay. A lot of times, if you're going to work with the people without just removing their free will and making them robots, you have to work with them in incremental steps. It's analogous to trying to get someone unaddicted to drugs. You start by giving them things like, methane, I believe is the term. If you want to get someone over heroin, you slowly get them out of that kind of thing. You can't expect them to just be a normal, happy-go-lucky citizen right away. You slowly get them to a better place. This is just basics of psychology. Therapists know this. You just can't get your client in there and day one tell them everything that is wrong and expect them to walk out and be perfect. You try to get them to make incremental steps. If you got a narcissist, you got a sociopath, hey, let's start here. Let's start working in this area. Let's slowly move that kind of direction. What are you asking God to do? He gave them rule. And let's just go with the Torah. Let's just say those are rules or laws. He gave them those rules and laws, and immediately in Judges, they couldn't even keep them. They do all these horrible things. They can't even keep the basic rules that God gave them. So what are you like? So what, God should give them better laws, and they couldn't even keep the very little laws that He gave them to begin with? I mean, this is just discounting the way human psychology works, especially when you're working with a fallen people.
Yeah, the other thing I'll point out here is in the beginning of Beverly's statement, it sounds like he's doing an external critique and just going and saying, hey, this is my hypothesis. I'm going to point to these things as evidence for that. That's one thing. But then he goes back into the internal critique and then comes back out of it and says, we don't have to do it from this. We can go it based off this internal critique, based off loving kindness, stuff like that. The second thing I'll just point out is, or go ahead and say whatever you want to say.
I was just going to say, kindness is a virtue for sure, but it is a virtue among many. Sometimes we can't be kind. God, if He is perfectly loving and perfectly just, He cannot be kind to sin. He should not be kind to people committing child sacrifice.
Right. And the second thing I was just going to point out was that he brings in a value assumption into the argument and says, if God exists back then He should have done X. But that's just a value assumption based off of data that inscrutable data, to be honest with you. Like we know a lot of things about the ancient Near East, but you don't know what it was like to be immersed in that subculture. You don't know what should have been done because you're not there. And then again, if this is an internal critique, bringing in your own value theory into the internal critique is no longer an internal critique anymore.
Yeah, I mean, someone could say the same thing in 1,000 years. Why didn't they just talk to the Nazis? Why did they have to fight this big war? I mean, they could have just talked. No, it wouldn't have worked. We tried. And, with Chamberlain and everything, it's just sometimes if you're not actually in the moment, maybe you shouldn't be assuming that there was a better way. So, yeah. All right. We're going to get to some things here, and then I want to put up some slides. You'll see why in a minute.
Has been for most of Christianity, these excuses have led to unjust wars, campaigns, slavery, and subjugation of people groups that are the other, whether it's women, other races, homosexuals, etc.
Yeah, phenomenal.
Not phenomenal. No. There is no evidence in sociology that Christianity leads to more war and violence. And you don't take my word for it. You can take what the studies say. So here's a study I've cited for a while. The influence of religion on interstate armed conflict, government, religious preference, and first use of force, 1946 to 2002. So he ran a lot of robustness checks in this. So he says, a state with a median non-zero Christian GRP is 37% less likely to initiate an interstate armed conflict than a state with no Christian GRP. A state with a maximum Christian GRP is 54% less likely. State with a non-zero median Christian GRP is 60% less likely to initiate a fatal armed conflict than a state with no Christian GRP. State with a maximum Christian GRP is 73% less likely. And GRP refers to the government aspect. I forget the exact acronym, but it's a government aspect. So other studies show that if you're religious, you're less likely to be willing to participate in a territorial dispute. Great book. When I was researching this topic, I emailed several historians. Several of them independently said, just read this book. It answers all your questions. The Myth of Religious Violence. There is no evidence that Christianity has caused religious violence. Have Christians done violence? Yes, but that doesn't mean Christianity caused it. Just like when that vegan went and shot up the YouTube headquarters, that doesn't mean veganism was the cause necessarily. There are other psychological factors. There's no reason to think violence is necessarily the result of Christianity. William Cavanaugh says we must conclude that the myth of the wars of religion is finally incredible, which is to say false. A significant proportion of the violence was between members of the same church, and members of different churches often collaborated. It is impossible to separate religious motives from political, economic, and social causes. And the idea that the advent of the state solved the violence ignores abundant evidence that state building was perhaps the most significant cause of violence. So, what is the basic point here? You just can't assert that war language in the Bible has led to more violence. You need actual evidence to demonstrate that. That's an assertion. We need to see actual data, especially when the studies, historical and sociological studies, show that is very unlikely to be the cause. There's no evidence Christianity leads to more war and violence. In fact, the data shows it seems to decrease the amount of wars and violence humans want to initiate or participate in. So just because Christians may have committed violence in the past, which they have, that doesn't mean Christianity was the cause or the Bible was the cause. Okay? Correlation is not causation. What do you want to add, Sam?
Nothing. You're the goat when it comes to that topic. So
I love studying it, man. It's like, dude, like if you're atheists make these claims all the time that like religion do bad thing. This is why we're opposing it so much. And I'm like, please study the sociology, guys. You do not know how good Christianity has been for this planet. And to spend your lives trying to get people to deconvert from it is really not a good idea. I mean, you should research the topic of Chesterton's fence to see why.
I mean, you even have some of the old new atheists like Peter Boghossian and Richard Dawkins and all these other people being like, "Yeah, we made a bad judgment call. We need to go back." Like,
yeah, it is rather interesting. So yeah, there's no evidence that Christianity is causing more war and violence. Okay, it's another factor that, when thrown into the mix of human civilization, human societies, seems to decrease war and violence ultimately. Do Christians again cause war? Yes, Christians have caused war, but that doesn't mean the motive was Christianity. Oh, by the way, that study, you're like this. It also looked at Buddhism and Islam. It found that Islam is positively associated with more war. So Islam may actually be a factor that could lead to more war and violence. But not Christianity. Christianity was negatively correlated with that. So, all right. Let's put this slide back up here. Where are we at? 19. All right. Yeah, let's play a little bit more here, and then we'll see where we're at.
Phenomenal. Great clarity of thought. And we're not going to solve this in today's video. This is why you can have apologetics. If you couldn't have this kind of an argument, you would never have a regular person be able to read the Bible, see the heinous things that God does prescribe, and say, this is okay. You have to make excuses. And this is the creative way that Christians for a long time have made these excuses. God gets a halt pass. That's really what everything comes down to, because he's even clear enough to agree in his initial clip from that girl, you're right, Lot did terrible things, but that wasn't God. But then when I can show God also did these things, Michael says, they're no longer terrible. That's the crux of the issue. As soon as you make an excuse for God, or God is in this other plane, then guess what? Morality is not objective anymore. If God has a different morality than us, it's subjective.
Okay, wow. That is not how ethics works.
Philosophical blunders I was talking about.
Philosophical blunder. Yeah, it's no. Someone's ontology can change what is morally right or wrong for them. For example, I mean, I think you would agree with me. It would be morally wrong for me to just walk into the women's bathroom right now in a public place, but it's not morally wrong for a woman to, okay?
Yeah.
We don't say that everyone has the same moral oughts or the moral duties, the same moral prescriptions. Your ontology, your position in society can change that. It would be wrong for me to execute someone, not wrong for like a judge to send someone to be executed. Like just with humans, you can see that moral values and duties change, but that doesn't mean morality is not objective. That's not at all what that means. I don't understand wow. It seems like they're confusing a lot of things here, because they seem to be saying, and if I'm right, that if God has different moral obligations and duties, then morality is subjective? I have never heard one philosopher argue that, yes, every single creature or creator or being in existence has the same moral values and duties. No, I've never heard anyone say that.
Yeah.
Anything you want to add there?
Not really.
No. Yeah, I mean, like, well, let's look at something else. So let's say utilitarianism is true. They've not established a normative ethic in this video. We're virtue ethicists, so they got to judge by that. Let's say utilitarianism is true, okay? Then what you ought to do depends on how much pleasure or value you bring out for the most amount of people. So in some instances, killing certain people could be the moral thing to do, even though it could cause harm, depending on your normative ethic here. A good way to think about this. Okay, here's a good way to think about why this doesn't mean morality is subjective just because moral values and duties change based on ontology and circumstances. I believe this analogy comes from Thomas Nagel. He uses a roadmap analogy. Right now, there's an objective way for me to get across town that would be the fastest way. There's objectively a fastest way to get across town. But that can change based on the time of the day, depending on traffic, construction, lights. Okay, just because those circumstances can change what is the objective fastest way to go, that doesn't mean it's all subjective. There still is an objective fastest way to go. And just because circumstances can change what is morally right or wrong, that doesn't mean morality is subjective. Right. So that doesn't follow. Like Bernard Williams, he's a virtue ethicist. He uses this analogy in his work about if you were in South America and let's say they had wound up like 20 some natives and they said, we're going to kill all of them. But because you're a foreigner and we want to have a little fun, we'll let you kill one and we'll let the other 19 go. He says the moral thing to do is to kill one of them, unfortunately. You should feel remorse. You should feel sadness about it, but you're saving 19 lives. Okay, so circumstances change what the moral ought is. I don't know of any philosopher that would deny that.
Yeah, this is just part of my issue with a lot of this response again. I'm going to sound like a broken record, but it's just a lot of these responses are just not really engaging with the topic philosophically in a rigorous way. These just seem like catch-all catchphrases that I've heard tons of times on the internet.
Yeah. And again, God's moral value, moral duties and obligations. Again, we don't mean someone has obligated it to him, because that's not what we mean when we're talking in normative ethics, are different than humans are because of his foreknowledge, his ontology, his lack of sin as well, his ability to be the perfect judge. These are all going to change. You just can't say God killed someone, therefore he's immoral, because it's wrong for a human to kill someone. That doesn't philosophically follow in any way. Like, again,
and it doesn't follow that morality is subjective from there.
Yeah, please read up on ethics, guys. Like, you just can't say that because someone else has different duties and obligations, therefore morality is subjective. It just reveals like how little you know on it, unfortunately. That just makes me sad to hear that. I mean that totally. So
this is why I just think it fails. And it's semantically pleasing to Christians. It was to me for a long time to be able to say, yeah, God can do what he wants. This is the idea of God's sovereignty. But I think there comes a time for each believer when they wrestle with this, which hopefully they do, when they're going to come out on one of those two sides, that makes sense and is just, or that it doesn't and it's not. And what I hate is the gaslighting for people that come out on the latter point of, well, who are you to judge? This God can do what he wants. Well, then that would be true of any higher power. And we wouldn't make these same exceptions for any other God. And Michael doesn't either. When he does an internal critique of the Quran and of Allah and Muhammad and their morality, he 100% puts his, what would be to Allah, subjective morality in play to judge that being incorrect. The fact that he doesn't...
Okay, real quick. I have never judged Allah for wanting to end a sinful life. I have judged Allah because he prescribed bad behavior to Muhammad, like polygamy. We know polygamy is harmful to women and children. Studies have shown that. Okay, why would Allah prescribe that? Why would he prescribe child marriage? So that's my problem. I don't think it would be wrong for Allah to end my life if he does exist right now. Because again, God has a right to end any sinful life when he sees fit. So again, there's a difference there. When I critique Islam, this is not a double standard. I have honed in on very specific things in Islam that I can show are immoral. I've not just said that, oh, it's wrong for Allah to do X, Y, and Z, because you can say that, God of the Bible does it. No, that's not a fair comparison.
Doesn't see the reversal, I think, is problematic. But this is, and why I want to take one more minute here. This is the base.
Did you want to say something, Fan?
No, we can keep
All
going.
right.
Basis for the rest of the video, because now we're going to argue, A, did God prescribe it or describe it? And if it's being described, it's bad. Michael will agree. But if at any point we can show it's prescribed, then it's weaseled out by, well, it's God, so it can't be bad. That's not an argument. And I understand why people think it's an argument. And if it helps you sleep better at night as a believer who knows these things are in your Bible, that's why it's there. But it should not be needed to excuse an all-perfect, all-loving, all-just God. We simply can know better.
Christians should use what's called the outsider test for faith and put themselves in a neutral position and then evaluate the Quran and then tell themselves if they end up in the Islamic hell because Islam turns out to have been true, would they then say, oh, I can't judge Allah because he's God and he can do what he wants?
Yeah, it's just...
Okay, they seem to be not aware that Islam is very different in how they view God. So we say in Christianity, God is love, God is just. There are certain things he cannot do, like he cannot stop loving us. He cannot like commit a horrible sin. He can't sin. That's not the same with Allah. Allah is not a loving God. He is not a father to anyone in Islam. He could very well, he is the best of deceivers in the Quran. He could very well, at the end of time, throw all the Muslims in hell and rescue the Jews just because he wants to. If Islam is true, it's not that I have to be like, change the way I sort of view things, just the way I view the Bible. It's my entire metaphysics needs to be changed because the entire aspect of a loving God is just thrown right out the window of Islam. So not a good comparison because they don't understand the differences between how Muslims view Allah and how Christians view the God of the Bible. So it doesn't work here. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, he brought up the outsider's test for the faith. And my question then here is just going to be, how are we not fulfilling any of those criteria that people like John Loftus and all them want to put up? Like, I would say that we're the types of people that are probably more entrenched into the scholarship on both sides than most Christians and even most atheists. So it was just kind of a weird point to bring up, I guess. I was kind of wanting to understand it more.
All right. Let's see where we're at here. I'm going to play a little bit more, and then we're going to skip ahead, I think, to the 25-minute mark.
Consistency. And this is the cry for my entire video.
Another thing to keep in mind is knowledge of the future. That will change your duties and obligations. God has different moral obligations and duties because of his... All right, they're going to get to the foreknowledge thing a little bit later, so I think I'm just going to skip this section now because I think I have notes on that later. Anything you want to say in this section at all, or are you okay to skip ahead?
I'll save it for later.
Yeah, I mean, again, we're going to get to the foreknowledge thing when they bring it up later. Because I think the reason why I say that, I think they articulated it better later on. So I want to take the better representation of it. So,
sense.
I think Michael Jones is basically tying himself in a knot here that's going to come back and haunt him if he's logical and fair. Once you say, oh, God knows the future and he's tweaking with things to get the outcome he wants, you've completely undercut free will. And you're essentially arguing that we're meat puppets of Jehovah, who's just playing a game with himself.
So that was the last main.
No, that's a false dichotomy. Okay, it's not that either God has to stay entirely out and we have free will, or God has any involvement and we have no free will. Like,
no.
Yep, you had some good notes on this. Go ahead.
Yeah, so the example I would just give is like my son really likes cookies, right? If he goes, and we're weird, we keep our cookies in the fridge.
Yeah, that's you freaking Canadians.
But like, if my son goes to the fridge and goes into the Ziploc bag and grabs a cookie, and I take the cookie away and I say, "Hey, you have to wait till after dinner to have that," am I taking away my son's free will? The answer is clearly not. He has the ability to make choices between X and Y. Me taking away the cookie after he made the choice doesn't automatically mean that he couldn't make the choice. Now, if you're going to disagree with me and say that, no, I took away his free will, what we're actually debating about isn't whether or not he has free will. We're debating what free will is in the first place. So this just doesn't follow.
Yeah, I make the distinction sometimes between the ability of free will and the availability of free will.
Yeah.
God tweaking things lowers or reduces someone's availability without removing the ability. And again, you can tweak things without entirely moving their free will. God can interact with people just like we interact with people. We don't remove their free will. So again, there's a lot of middle ground there that's just sort of skipped over. All right, let's skip ahead a little bit more here about getting to the Abraham and Hagar section. All right.
Not cared for by God? Because that's the logical implication here. And what Brandon's pointing out in terms of God's prescription is that God is behind this design and commanding her to go back and
Real quick, just for context, they're talking about when God commands Abraham to send Hagar away in Genesis.
submit as a slave. This is wrong. And for them to continue to make an apology for this is it only works in this extra world of, well, God's doing it, so it's okay.
This is why I'm glad I have you on, because I actually wouldn't have made your first.
All right. Anything you want to say on that section before we get to what Brandon has to say?
No, not really.
All right. Let's just
go ahead.
Yeah, let's just play a little bit more here. Okay.
Point where my mind and I agree with it completely. If you follow the logic, it actually makes a worse case for this God and the point that we're trying to make of his immorality as it's described. My point here is this is the first example where they do state no prescriptions. And I have two here. I have the prescription from the verse where God tells Abraham to do as his wife Sarah commands and exile the slave woman. And then the second prescription is shown by God sending an angel, like you said, to send this runaway slave back to her mistreating masters. They don't address this. They start getting into, the excuse of, well, God provided for Hagar. Yeah, because it was Abraham's seed. But they do not address the fact that she was indeed a foreign slave, not an indentured servant, that she was used to make a baby. They don't talk about the mistreatment or bringing her back. They just want to quibble over, well, God still provided for Hagar, so everything Brandon said doesn't matter. And giving.
Okay, because there's a lot of circumstances that need to be taken into account when you make that sort of assumption. First of all, God telling Abraham to send Hagar away is not evidence he's doing something immoral or prescribing something immoral. For one, his knowledge of his foreknowledge could very well be preventing disaster, fighting between Ishmael and Isaac. And what does he do? He takes a slave woman, sends her away with Ishmael, and Ishmael is supposed to become a great nation. That means Hagar is no longer a slave. He has essentially made her into given her a much better status, because as Ishmael grows and becomes a great nation, what is she going to be? Still a slave? No, she's been made into something far greater at that point. So, and again, if it was just because the seed was Ishmael, why didn't God just send Ishmael away? Hagar can say she's just a slave. You need servants. No, Hagar gets to go with Ishmael to become part of this new great nation. So that doesn't follow at all. I mean, like, you're just assuming the worst possible explanation for this and not applying the principle of charity. What do you want to say on that, Than?
You said everything I was just going to say. We can keep going.
Yeah. I mean, like, these are just unjustified assumptions. Okay. So again, we admit God is working in circumstances here. Okay. Abraham is not perfect. Sarah is not perfect. Hagar is not perfect. Okay. Is he going to come in and remove their free will? No, he's going to work with where they are to try to get them to a better place. And what is one of the first things he does? He gets Hagar out of this slave situation so she can become like the regent mother, in a sense, of this new great nation. I mean, I don't understand how you could come away without thinking that actually that's kind of a better situation for her if you detest slavery so much.
The other thing, now that I just thought about it, is that if you remember in the beginning where I said we kind of play fast and loose with what the word prescription means, this is one of those instances where I think we're playing fast and loose with what it means. I don't think God is giving a moral prescription as to like what anybody ought to do at all times and places or anything like that here. I think this is God working within specific circumstances.
Yeah. All right. So they're going to play a little bit of our video. I don't think we need to play it because it's kind of the same stuff we're talking about. We're talking about how Abraham is not in a cultural vacuum, but this next section we're going to respond to. Oh boy. Okay. This was one of the ones I'm sorry. I don't even know what happened here with this.
Where are we at?
You noted that.
We're at
9:44. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Here we go. Let's just play it.
I'll let you talk here. What did you want to say on that?
Michael Jones is making the claim that God showed up media res in a story and he had to gradually get the people to figure out moral codes and ethics. This
Yes, that's what I'm saying, that God showed up when Abraham was already imperfect.
argument is completely undercut by the very fact that God is starting from scratch with Abraham. Abraham is not yet a Jew. There is no law. There is no Torah. There is no Tanakh. Abraham is meeting with God fresh from the start. So God at this time does not have to work in a cultural structure that Abraham is going to buck against. God could have given Abraham anything he wanted to. What is Abraham going to say? Well, Lord, I've always done it this other way. No, of course not. The argument itself is ludicrous. His point makes perfect sense in the Brits showing up in the middle of a culture. It makes absolutely zero analogous sense here how he's using it.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay, when I first heard that, my first thought was, dude, there's still time to delete this. What did you just say?
How old was Abraham when this happened? Where was he? Was he just like in this like white void, like where there was no sense, like was there nothing around him, like no cultural environment, or was he just in a vacuum?
Like, dude, no. I mean, like, this is just blatantly false. Abraham had a culture he came from. He came from the city of Ur. He was not just a blank slate, guys. I mean,
Yeah.
wow. I was like that. Like, if any section I would delete from this video, I would go back and edit that part out, because like that's just blatantly false. Of course, God had to work with where Abraham was if he didn't want to remove his free will, because he came from a cultural background, the ancient Near East. What?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. That I mean, I don't know what to say other than that's just blatantly false. I'm sorry if I'm coming across like rude. I'm just frustrated because I couldn't even fathom the fact that Beverly made that argument. Like that doesn't even make sense. Like no, Abraham was not a blank slate. I'm sorry, that doesn't work. So, all right,
His parents
call
didn't teach him anything either. So,
yeah. Abraham's parents, they never taught him anything. No, I mean. No. All right, let's get to some super chats so I can calm down. All right, do you ever upload your slides to Patreon? No, I can if people start asking and demanding that. I mean, if people message me on Patreon and they want slides, I give it to them. I've always done that. Thank you for becoming a new member. Appreciate that. What would David Wilber and others say about the Torah being not valid to Gentiles? There's a lot of do forever in the Torah and for the foreigner. Well, I mean, Sasha Stern says there's not really forever. He makes the case in his book, Time and Process in Ancient Judaism, that word olam means permanent. And it refers to just being like a permanent law of the covenant. Like, as long as this covenant is in effect, this is a permanent law, not that it is forever. This is a mistranslation. So I don't know what he would say on that. I've not read his new book, but yeah, that's, and I'm not convinced Christians have to keep Torah or Mosaic law. So for many, many reasons. How does the Old Testament not teach virtue ethics when Rahab literally lied and was called righteous for it because of being saved? Yeah, I just think virtue ethics was the standard view of ethics until we got deontology and, utilitarianism and consequentialism. I just think that was how people thought of ethics naturally. If that doesn't say anything, I'm just going to keep going.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. I would ask everyone to watch Paul Copan versus Randall Rouser. Randall really lays out how God did command all the children and women who were affected. Yeah, I'll check it out. I have not seen that. Randall also says Numbers 31 is about sex slavery. Yeah, I think that comes from Moses, and Copan even makes that argument as well. Why are humans favored over animals by God? So for one thing, it has more to do with God's divine providence, just like the Levites were chosen to be the priests. It's for that. And I also think it's because God can actually have a working relationship with humans because of our intelligence. It's harder to do that with another creature that can't do philosophy or something like that. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know where you land the plane on this, but I think all animals will be universally reconciled. And I take Trent Doherty's view.
Yeah.
So you agree with me on that? Or
yeah,
I know. Okay, cool. So I mean, so in that sense, I'm just gonna say favored in what sense? Favored and as in we're just kind of selected to be and made in God's image and have this functional role, and then later on in eschaton, we'll get these specific roles in the eschaton. Sure, but I think God sees value in animals just as much. So yeah, I don't know. I'll kind of keep it at that.
Yeah, I think humans were selected to be God's image bearers, but that would be where I would land on that. Okay. Thanks for the answer. I wanted to ask about Deuteronomy 20, where the Israelites are given instruction on how to treat nations that they were to inherit in comparison to other nations. Yeah, I mean, again, it's not strict law. This is just sort of explaining how justice and wisdom could work in that society in an ideal setting. Okay, you have to also remember when you're reading the stipulations of the Torah, it's about ideal settings necessarily in that culture. So yeah, that's what I would say. No, it's a tad off topic, but would you think that conditional prophecy might offer a defeater to full theistic determinism? Response to prophecy seems to suggest free will. Yeah, I do. I think it does for sure. Yeah. All right, I'm gonna put the video back up here so we can move along. I think I want to skip ahead a little bit here because they're just starting to hit a lot of the same points we've already addressed. So I'm gonna go ahead at about a minute or so.
I talked about a root cause of something that is, of course, multifaceted. And I don't believe in the biblical account. So I think there are generic reasons that all of this has come about. But the religious people who believe in these stories have absolutely caused division based off this. We can even see it in the New Testament with Paul, who carries this thought forward. Let's read from Galatians 4. But what does Scripture say? Get rid of the slave woman and her son, for the slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with the free woman's son. Therefore, brothers and sisters, we are not children of the slave woman, but of the free woman. This is Paul, the greatest spokesperson, the direct revelation from Christ, utilizing Old Testament Scripture to cause further division, which is obviously what would have been caused, which is all I pointed out, a God with foreknowledge who chooses to have this secondary son with less inherent value. Because why? He's from a slave, because they had less inherent value.
Then is Paul causing division here?
No, I don't think so. This just seems to be a very poorly interpreted.
It's very poorly interpreted, because Galatians 4:24, Paul says, now this may be interpreted allegorically. These women are two covenants. One is from Mount Sinai, being the children of slavery. She is Hagar. He's not saying treat like the descendants of Hagar badly. He's saying I'm using these two women as an analogy for covenants.
Yes.
This is blatantly taken out of context. Neither God nor Paul say that Hagar had less inherent value. This is an unjustified assumption again. What? That's not what Paul's saying. Read the context. I don't know. I don't know what to do, man. What was that? Why even bring up Galatians 4? It's clearly an analogy.
The same book, by the way, that says, like, there's no slave, nor Jew, nor Greek, nor...
It's the prior chapter. The prior chapter, he says there's neither Jew nor Greek, free nor slave, male nor female. We are all one in Christ. So he literally says equality. Brandon doesn't cite that part. Doesn't cite verse 24 where Paul says, I'm speaking allegorically here. That is blatantly taking Paul out of context. I don't know what to do. I couldn't even believe that when I heard that. Yeah, I agree. All right, I moved up a little bit more here.
Acknowledging that we can work towards making a better future as humans, because we can all recognize that our differences are really cultural, and at heart we are all the same. There's no special people. There's no chosen race. That's bigotry. It's wrong.
All right,
and it's hurtful.
More. Perfect, man. I'm so glad.
Okay, so he's upset that there's a chosen race, is what he said. And he says that's bigoted and hurtful because the Jews are the chosen people. If I understand the argument correctly, is that how you understood it?
Yes.
Yeah, that's not what it is. God literally says in the Torah, you've not been chosen because of something special about you.
Yeah.
He says, I've called you in Isaiah to be a light to the nations. God never says they're chosen because they're special. Anything you want to add to that?
No, it seems to be one of the things I wish I would have seen a lot more in this would have been like justifications for these particular readings that they're putting out, if that makes sense.
It's Deuteronomy 7 where he says this.
Slides aren't up.
No, I'm not. What are you saying?
Are you? Oh, I thought you were going to put slides up.
I will in a second here, but no, but it's Deuteronomy 7. So he says, the Lord God has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of the people who are on the whole face of the earth. Verse 7, it is not because you were more in number than any other people that the Lord set his love on you and chose you, for you were the fewest of all people, but it is because the Lord loves you and is keeping his oath that he swore to your fathers. Okay. So it's not like there's something special about them. And again, what does God say in the book of Isaiah? I have chosen you to be a light to the nations. This is the whole point of the new covenant. God chose Israel, not because they were special, but because they were supposed to be the beginners of initiating the new covenant to call all people back, that Paul talks about in places like Acts 17. So what do we also see in the new covenant? God shows no partiality. There's no special. The Jews are not special. Galatians chapter 3. Okay. There's no Jew nor Greek, free nor slave. We're all one in Christ. They're chosen for a special purpose, to be a light to the nations, not because they were some sort of special race. The Bible, again, if you're doing an internal critique, you got to go on what the Bible actually says here. So, again, and real quick, Mike Winger has a really good video on the passage of Jesus calling the Canaanite woman a dog. It's actually not an insult. There would have been another word he could have used on that. Okay, again,
Yeah.
And you just can't do that because that's whataboutism. What does the whole context of the Bible say? God shows no partiality. We're all equal in Christ. The Jews were not chosen because they were at some sort of like special race of some sort above everyone else. So problems there. And one slide I want to put up here. So let me put up this slide here real quick. Where does the idea of equality come from? Well, the historian Tom Holland points out that humanism derives ultimately from claims made in the Bible, that humans are made in God's image, that the Son died equally for everyone, that there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. Repeatedly, like a great earthquake, Christianity has sent reverberations across the world. The idea of equality, for example, Holland argues, comes out of Christianity. Prior to that, it didn't really exist. So if you're going to, it's really weird that we turn around and attack the Bible from the very principles we got from the Bible.
Yeah.
All right. Let's keep going along here. I'll put this back up. I think I want to jump ahead a little bit more to save time here instead of hitting a lot of it. No, let me think here. No, let's play a little bit more here.
So glad to have you on. Again, an endorsement here of why you should be checking out Michael's channel.
What is the problem here? We see in like the very next patriarch, the sons of Isaac are literally fighting with each other and trying to kill each other.
Yeah.
Like maybe God actually, given his knowledge of the future here, knows what he's doing. I got to split these boys up because they're going to kill each other. Then he looks at Esau and Jacob and goes, well, I think I can still work with that. But if Isaac and Ishmael stay together, it could be really bad on that timeline.
So Michael Jones is saying because God knows the future, he can see that these two half-brothers will have lots of conflicts, just like the sons of Isaac will ultimately have. He's saying God can see these things happening, but the problem is one, if God can tweak the future, why couldn't God make it work out better? If that's your argument.
Yes.
Or two, what
all right, real quick. We're saying, why couldn't God make it better? What is your response to that?
This just to me sounds like the evidential problem of evil. And like you could just literally reduce this down to the evidential problem of evil. What is God supposed to do? When is he supposed to interfere? All these other things. Those are so highly debated in the philosophical literature.
Yeah.
So just like assuming these things going into things is not you have to make arguments, right? God should have interfered here and done this here. That's just question begging for a particular value theory.
Right. And you could also argue plausibly there were no better timelines. So if you don't have foreknowledge, how can you say that there was a better option given the psychology of these individuals? Again, if this is an internal critique, this is a defeater for that. It's really easy to see that even a lot of like atheistic philosophers would agree with here. So again, you just can't say that, well, there was a better way if you don't even know there was. That doesn't work. So
and what does better even mean in this context? Like
exactly.
There's so much debate.
Right. Is it better in a utilitarian sense, in a deontic sense, in a virtue ethical sense? Like what is define what would be better? Because oftentimes when atheists use the problem of evil, they assume a utilitarian outlook that God has to act in ways to sort of increase pleasure and decrease suffering. And that doesn't follow if you're working in deontology or virtue ethics. Because
right.
like if it's virtue ethics, you're trying to increase virtue. And sometimes you need suffering for that.
And the last thing I'll just add in here is a lot of times what happens in these types of conversations is people just assume that the only types of action guiding norms for God are going to be meta-ethical in nature rather than meta-normative, meaning God is only going to have ethical considerations when he's talking about when he's planning out different kinds of worlds he'd create or whatever it might be and what he's going to do. But there's going to be other value domains that are going to be put into the equation, such as the alethic, aesthetic, and moral domains, for instance. So
yeah. All right, let me just back up a little bit here, and then we're going to talk about omnipotence.
That's your argument.
Yes.
Or two, what he also seems to be implying is even though things ended up terrible and then God worked them for good, this is turtles all the way down.
Yeah. And then we get back to his car example of, well, maybe with God's perfect foreknowledge, this actually is, even though it's so horrendous, but it's like, yeah, we're putting limitations on God. Either God interferes and he should do a better job of interfering, or we need free will and he doesn't interfere. And
Than, have we ever said God does not have limits?
No. And this is another common thing is people for some reason think omnipotence is you can do an unlimited number of things or something like that. Again, if you look at the philosophical literature, there's tons of conceptions of omnipotence. This is not one of them.
I mean,
it is one of them, but it's like not one of the main ones.
Yeah. Even if you go back to Augustine, Augustine said that God can't do everything. Omnipotence has not meant without limits or the ability to do everything. It means you're you have power. No one can, if you're omnipotent, You're more powerful than anything else in existence, and no one can ever overpower you. But being omnipotent also means you cannot like cease to exist. Okay, there's a limit, so to speak, in that sense. So this is just straw man of what Christian theology teaches. Okay, if God is going to work with free creatures in this situation, okay, he's not going to remove their free will. He's not going to forcibly change their psychology to be better. He's going to allow them to make their own choices. Okay, then he has set limits on himself to have meaningful relationships in the long run with free creatures. So yes, there is certain things God cannot do if he has made these limits on purpose. So that needs to be taken into account. Anything else you want to add before we move on?
Nope.
Yeah, guys. When we talked about omniscience, and God's omniscience changes his obligations because he can see the future and he can bring about better things based on the circumstances. Okay, that also needs to be taken into account with how we understand omnipotence. I thought it was just clear that this is just because if you look in the philosophical literature, this is just clear. That's what omnipotence is. It's God does not have the ability to do anything he wants. That does not logically follow.
And he keeps just jumping back and forth between the two. And also, the only way to solve that was to exile Hagar and Ishmael is insane. I have 2 kids, and I don't care how old they ever get or how terrible they ever get to each other. One of the options that will never be on the table is sending my wife and one of the children away. Like, it's even if God takes care of them, that can't be the best solution. Why not soften the heart of Ishmael to be nice to his younger brother Isaac and understanding both roles that they would play? Like, if you want to start making hypotheticals about what God could have done or should have done or why he might have done this, I can play that game too. And mine can always be better. He could have softened the heart. He could have showed up and explained. He could have never had Ishmael in the first place by preventing the rape of Hagar.
And we notice in the script.
All right, real quick. Okay. So yeah, God could have removed their free will or just changed their psychology. But then again, that's just God turning us into robots to be the way we're supposed to be.
Right.
And I know it sounds really nice in Western homes to say, I would never do that kind of thing. You got to get outside of that bubble and see how human cultures have changed over time. There have been families that have actively separated in Islam because of honor killings, where a woman was threatened to be killed by her own brothers for an honor killing. In that instance, yes, the best thing to do is to get her away from her family, especially her own brothers, if they want to commit some horrible atrocity like an honor killing. If God can see the future and see there is going to be bad things that are happening between Ishmael and Isaac, then yes, the best thing to do is to get them away. Like, it sounds very nice in the comfort of your Western home to say, I would never split my family up because we live in a very blessed and privileged society, but that's just not the way humanity has been for the longest period of time.
Yeah.
Anything you want to add there?
I lost it.
Yeah, I mean, he mentions God could have shown up. Well, God did show up with like Israel and Moses, and they still fought with God, like throughout the entire Exodus narrative.
I just
like
remember
this is,
what I was going to say.
Yeah, real quick, we don't live in an episode of Touched by an Angel. Okay.
Yeah.
That's just so unrealistic. Okay. God shows up. If we're doing internal critique again, God does show up in the Israelite Exodus, and they rebel, they fight. They don't just go, oh, you're right, God, we'll just all be nice and get along. That's because that's not how human psychology works.
Yeah. And what's interesting is they call it earlier in their video, right? They're calling it a breaking of free will for God to interfere with the actions of free creatures. But now they're saying God should have just changed somebody's heart and changed their desires, as if that would not be interfering with their free will. That was just an inconsistency that I caught.
Yeah, good point. All right. Again, we're skipping ahead a little bit because a lot of the things they say they've repeated earlier, we've addressed. I don't want to just keep rehashing the same points. So here we go. I'm great. Like, this doesn't seem to be bad.
Okay, I wanted to call this out. This is the kind of games that I think are played within apologetics that IP is doing here that I just want to show. He is making this, again, false comparison that in the ancient world, we would have never had, the son of a slave be able to rise to heights, except Ishmael isn't the son of a slave. He's the son of a slave woman, which doesn't matter. What matters is the dad. And the dad, for all intents and purposes, according to God, is the most important man of all time. So God protecting Hagar's son, which has nothing to do with Hagar, it has to do with Ishmael, has everything to do with the lineage coming from Abraham. This is just completely inappropriate to say that the lowest of the low. This is the son of the most important man you've ever created. This isn't the lowest of the low. This isn't God usurping ancient rule. This is clear favoritism and showing that some things matter more more because of the status of free men versus slave women. Anything else, or do you want to move on?
Yeah, well, one quick thing here. When Michael Jones just said that God had promised to make Ishmael into a great nation. Now, when I read the names of the tribes that came from the 12 sons of Ishmael, I didn't recognize them. I challenge you to tell me, what great nation is Michael Jones talking about? Apparently, God either A, forgot this promise or didn't fulfill it. And it also undercuts his argument.
Or, to escape the false dichotomy, it's that it just doesn't narrate literally everything that has happened on planet Earth.
Right.
Like, that doesn't follow. And to address some of the earlier points, okay, again, if it's all about Ishmael because he's the son of Abraham, why is Hagar not kept in slavery? Being sent away with Ishmael promotes her because now she's like the regent mother, queen mother of this new great nation that's being formed. She's obviously promoted in some incredibly great way. Also, if it's about Abraham, Abraham gets nothing out of Ishmael. Hagar is the one who's going to get the inheritance of Ishmael there, who's going to take care of her, promote her, and be this great nation with her involved. Abraham's not involved. So Abraham gets nothing out of Ishmael. He has to rely just on Isaac being the fulfillment of that. So again, it doesn't follow because, again, the actual text shows us Hagar is being cared for and being taken out of her slave status.
I really want to know what they mean by the word favoritism in a lot of these contexts too. Because if by favoritism you just mean, hey, God had like this appointed person that he's going to bring about this plan with, again, trivial. It doesn't really tell us whether or not God is evil.
Right.
You'd have to show us like an instance in which God is looking at one person, two people, both who have like the same exact moral character, same exact everything, and God's like, oh, well, because of no reason at all, I'm just going to show favor to this person. And by favor, I mean, I'm just going to give them a bunch of stuff despite nothing. I want to know what they mean by favoritism here, because it just seems like this is a rhetorical move to try to get them closer to the conclusion, even though it's not.
Yeah. Again, so bottom line is with the whole, because we're going to move on, the whole Abraham and Hagar thing. There is no good evidence that sending Hagar away is therefore God prescribing evil. Because again, let's say God shows up in Afghanistan and prescribes to a father, get your daughter out of there because her brothers are going to commit an honor killing. Then he's doing something good at that point. So exiling someone is not necessarily evil. They have not established that. They just assume it is, and they ignore numerous circumstances that show this is not God prescribing evil here. So a lot of issues here all around. All right, you ready to move on?
Yep.
Perfect God. So our next two are Jacob and Joseph. And we've got really similar things happening here. We have this argument between me saying God prescribed something we would consider immoral, whether it is Jacob getting the birthright from his brother Esau through deception, or whether it is Joseph getting favor from God to interpret dreams and become assisting to the Pharaoh that hurts the Egyptians and helps the Jews, which is kind of my point here about God taking care of his chosen people. We see blessings from God on both of these men for uncharitable and or immoral behavior. That's the next two examples. I and Michael want to spend a lot of time with Moses and Joshua and David and Samson. So I don't want to skip this. I will say that IP made a good point that it's murkier. It's not all ambiguity. It's not all description. There are prescriptions that are made here. But Michael, what I'd like you to speak to is, just so we can kind of cover over both of these points, what did you hear from IP that you thought was unfair here that you might want to address? So just kind of cover over this one at a higher level.
Well, what he's missing here is that God is behind this, that God is the blesser or the withholder of blessing. And he's making the point that God can tweak things because he knows the future. So when Esau gives up his birthright for a bowl of porridge, and then Jacob later deceives his father, what you and I are arguing is that God could have stepped in and said, I will not bless deception and lies because that is against my character. The birthright belongs to Esau, and because I am the all-powerful God, I will use Esau to bring about a great nation. This is the part where...
So this is where we get back to the idea of God, them assuming a hermeneutic or a theology we don't have. We never said God lacks limits, because that's not what omnipotence means. It means all powerful. That doesn't mean you can do literally anything. Again, if God in his foreknowledge can look ahead on two timelines, one where Esau is chosen, one where Jacob is chosen, he can very well just say, okay, I will work with the circumstances that these sinful humans have produced, and I will use Jacob because that can produce a better timeline ultimately. That's not blessing the sin for the same reason that we see in Genesis 50:20, what you meant for evil, God used for good. So right there in the text, we're told that kind of thing.
I got nothing.
Anything? Yeah. All right, I'm gonna move ahead a little bit here because a lot of these points were hit earlier, and again, they're just assuming theologies we don't have or have promoted
on everyone. My point about him only caring to utilize punishment when it interrupts his will is my case that God doesn't care to the larger extent, even enough to punish what is going on elsewhere until later. Like right now at the same time, do we not have tribes all over the world doing child sacrifice, which is supposedly so horrible to God? But we don't hear anything about this. We have no records of God showing up in ancient Olmec or Aztec and saying, this is bad, don't do this, or I have to.
Okay, Brandon answered this himself. We don't hear about it. That doesn't mean God is not detested by it and not producing judgments in ways. This is like, I don't know if it'd be.
Presumably Brandon is finds it detestable that there's like child marriage and other atrocities happening halfway across the world right now.
Yeah.
I don't see him doing anything about that. So he's probably actually in favor of it.
Yes. Good analogy there. Yeah. Obviously, Brandon isn't in favor of that just because he's not doing anything about it. Now, you could say that he's not omnipotent, but I mean, again, we live in comfortable homes. Why are we not selling literally everything we have to end that kind of stuff? Like that's a moral question that moral philosophers have raised. I think like Peter Singer first is like, why are we not like literally getting rid of all our wealth to help, end, child starvation, for example? Like, why are we not doing it? There's entire moral discussions around these kinds of questions. The same could apply to God. Okay. God very well could be enacting punishments, but also, God is slow to anger. God will execute his judgment on all ultimately through things like physical death and hell, for example, as well as judgment on the last day, these kinds of things. Just because God is merciful, slow to anger, hoping people repent, trying to show mercy in a lot of ways, that doesn't mean he doesn't that doesn't mean he approves of these things, and he's not actually enacting judgments in ways that are just not recorded in the Bible. The Bible doesn't really detail everything that has ever happened.
Right. And to be clear, because you said like, well, yeah, Brandon's not God. That's kind of missing the point of my analogy. I'm drawing out the reasoning process.
Right.
Right. And showing the reasoning process is flawed. Whether it's God or whether it's a normal like human agent, it doesn't really matter. The reasoning process itself is a non sequitur. You can't just argue from silence.
Yeah. All right, let's get to some super chats. Why did God allow stoning? What are your thoughts on that?
I think he was just working with the people that were there at the time. And if, again, a lot of these questions to me just seem to reduce down to the problem of evil. Why does God allow any evil thing? And I have tons of videos on the problem of evil. I think if you just have some sort of greater good theodicy or saint-making theodicy with an axiological assumption that God's justified in allowing defeasible evils, then the rest just kind of follows that none of these things are going to be evidences against theism or Christian theism in specific.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, again, so how do you punish people in the ancient world? Without they didn't have a prison system in place. How do you execute people? I mean, that are committing horrible atrocities. Like, you got to work with the people in the time and the culture at the time. Yep. So, I mean, yeah. And again, I think it also relates to what you said with like the same problem of evil aspect.
Yeah.
I have a question about freedom of will. If God allows women to be raped because of freedom of will, does that mean he cares about the rapist's right to rape than the woman's dignity? Well, no, that's not what we're saying here. We're talking about the problem. Again, this goes right back to what you were just talking about with the problem of evil.
Yeah.
It
doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't follow from what we're saying that he doesn't care about the woman's dignity or anything. If in fact what we see in the Bible and through our theological reasoning is that God cares deeply about these things, and it's through that he's going to bring a life to this type of person, either protologically or eschatologically, that is going to make her life on the whole good.
Yeah, and if you want, like, we could spend 2 hours addressing just this question, but if I think a video I have addressing it will just answer it, see my video, The Problem of Suffering, a Christian Response, and then you can watch my video, The Problem of Evil, a Christian Response. And I think that would answer it better than us just trying to rehash it out here. IP Than, if you were magically teleported to biblical times and could only save or let happen the Amalekite baby death, what would you do? That's assuming that that is actually what happened.
Yeah.
We've argued that that's hyperbolic nature. That actually didn't happen.
Correct.
No great nation has ever fallen. Okay. Hi, IP, what's your favorite Bible? I tend to just use the ESV default because that's kind of how I've been using for years. But I don't know if it's my favorite necessarily.
I use the ESV by default as well.
Yeah, it just happens to be the one I've used. Sorry having to repeat this, but I really want to hear your thoughts on Deuteronomy 20. It seems to challenge the idea of hyperbolic nature. I don't know what you would mean as to why it does. Well, we're not arguing that Deuteronomy 20 is hyperbolic nature. Like, you're talking about the commands there, like the things we interpret as commands. We're talking about how the Mosaic Law or Torah is more like a treatise on judicial wisdom. It's not necessarily giving commands. When we talk about hyperbolic nature, we're talking about Joshua more or so. So I'm not sure if you understood that correctly. So I hope that helps. We're not saying that it's hyperbole when it comes to commands in Deuteronomy. That's understood within how ancient Near Eastern law treatises function and what they were actually for. All right, let's put this video back up here. Let's see where we're at here. So I've skipped ahead a little bit to 47, I believe.
Yes, it's interesting here that Than is admitting that the culture at the time believed in multiple gods.
I put this in here just for you, okay? So let's play it.
Take that to its logical conclusion. The pre-Hebrew Israelite Jews, that culture, were Canaanites. And yes, they did believe in multiple gods. And yes, they did believe that the gods did battle for the people on their behalf and so forth. But it's hand waving from what happened.
All right. You want to address that?
Yeah. So I kind of saw this one coming because people really like to take this divine council stuff and being like, oh, well, you guys are admitting to polytheism. And it's like, well, let's slow down here. And it's actually talk about what we're saying here. When I'm saying the word God and the term Elohim, I would also argue that the Israelites thought Yahweh, or Adonai, if I'm going to be PC here, is species unique, as Michael Heiser would say. The God of the Old Testament, the God in the Hebrew Bible, is the creator being. He is like the one true God, and all these other gods are created beings that are temporal and limited and subject.
Real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let me add this in. Okay, so the word Elohim does not really translate to God necessarily. It really, Michael Heiser makes this case, it just means a spiritual being.
Correct.
So the God of the Bible is called Elohim, but divine beings of his holy council are the gods of foreign nations, demons, disembodied human. So oftentimes we tend to say, oh, it says there's multiple gods, but really it's saying there's multiple Elohim, which has a much broader meaning than what we mean by God in the English language.
Yes. For Michael and for Beverly and Brandon, if you haven't read Michael Heiser's Unseen Realm, like, that's a must read if you're going to get into some of these topics.
Yeah. If you want to do internal critiques, that would be a great place to start for sure. All right, let's move on ahead to another section here.
Said it was specifically babies. And here's the important distinction. Is it possible or probable or reality that some firstborns at any given time in a big population like the Egyptians will be babies and kids? Yes. I don't care if they're exclusively, I don't care how old the oldest firstborn is. Some firstborn are babies. They're acting like they weren't babies. Let's let Michael take over though.
It's not the first biological children that are being targeted. It's the heir designated.
Yeah.
So in ancient Egypt, you could designate an heir that wasn't even your own kid, because eunuchs could get heirs at times. So you could have an heir designator, and that's who's being targeted. A lot, like Ramesses II, Exodus Pharaoh, his son who died, we would argue died in the plague, was a full-grown adult. And these are not innocent people. These are also people that are engaging in the oppression of Israel here.
So I'm going to say one thing, and then Michael, I want to hear your thoughts. He's again trying to say, look at this example of this one person that wasn't innocent, that wasn't a baby. Yes, those people existed. That's not my case, though. And he's got to know this. This is an avoidance of the topic completely. And the only other thing I'll say before I turn the mic over to you is, if this is really, it didn't involve anyone outside of the court and it only meant the appointed heirs of people that were directly involved with the Egyptians, that still wouldn't make them innocent. But I don't believe we have any context from the Bible to believe that that's the case. Why did God's chosen people, or the Israelites at this time, have to paint blood over their doorposts, the lamb's blood, so that the angel of death would pass over? Anything you want to add?
Yes, in Exodus chapter 11, it's very clear. At midnight, the firstborn will die from the firstborn of the Pharaoh who sits on the throne to the firstborn of female slaves. So there's
Everyone.
no argument to make that the child of a slave has any culpability in any of this. They are a slave. In fact, God.
Okay, so they're talking about this whole like stretch that it was everyone. And again, we've argued over and over again, this is very hyperbolic in how it is recounting these kinds of things. Like that's the point. There's a lot of hyperbole happening here. Also, I will say this has actually been addressed. Let me put this up here.
David Falk.
Yeah, he just uploaded a video on this very recently.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, so here, evidence for the Exodus, who were the firstborn in Egypt in Exodus 12:29. So just did a video on this. So again, who's being, so again, we've already argued again. This goes back to the earlier point we made. We're arguing again, there's a hyperbolic nature here. We're not saying that babies were being targeted. The heir designators were the people that would have actually caused problems for Egypt. If you've got a bunch of babies, okay, those aren't going to cause problems for you by killing the oldest of them, because that's not the heir designate. Okay, if you have someone you've been training for a while, building up, and they die, that's a problem, because now you spent all this time and money and resources in your heir and they're gone. Okay, if you got babies, you could just get another one because you got multiple. You could designate as your firstborn or your heir in that sense. So, yeah. But again, I think we would still appeal to the hyperbolic nature of these accounts, and that's often what we've done there. So, anything you want to add?
I'm not too well read on this topic of philosophy of war, but it's an angle that I think people ignore as well. When you're looking at warfare texts and you're going to make moral judgments and like value judgments on what the warfare texts are saying and what's happening in there, believe it or not, there is a whole entire division of philosophy called philosophy of war, and you're making assumptions as to what is the best position when it comes to that topic when you're talking about these things. That being said, like, I don't have a particular position there. It's just something I think is worth pointing out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right, let's play another section of this and then we'll respond.
Moses was operating completely outside of the will and counsel of God at this point. If you or I send one of our...
So, okay, we're talking about Numbers 31, where we argue that when Moses commands the killing of all the Midianites, he's going against what God actually commands. So that's what he's responding to here.
Children down the street, knowing that they have a plan to vandalize the neighbor's house. As a parent, who's responsible? Us.
Yeah.
Because we know what our kid's going to do. If my kid says to me, hey, Dad, can I borrow your slingshot? I'm going to go shoot the neighbor's cat. And we hand him the slingshot. We're responsible. In fact, this is American law and jurisprudence. If your child or your charge does something and you're aware of it, and you supply them with the means and the power and the authority to do it, this is also military law. If a commander knows that a soldier under his authority is going to do something in violation of the Geneva Convention, the commander is responsible. So,
all right. So with regards to that, I get the analogy he's trying to make. I think it's a pretty good analogy. I don't think it works because, again, ontological differences between humans and God. Okay, with the kid analogy, for example, Moses isn't a child at this point. So we're talking about a God and an actual human, and we're also talking about parents and children. There's going to be an ontological difference there. So again, this just reduces, as you would probably argue, to the evidential problem of evil. What would you,
Correct.
Is that right, or would you say something else?
No, I would agree with that.
Yeah, we're circling back to that. And again, if God is on a different plane of existence, if he has foreknowledge, his moral obligations are going to be different. That goes back to our main point. God could see different futures and paths and go, okay, I need to allow this to happen for a better outcome ultimately. That logically follows if God does have the foreknowledge. God also has to work, if he's working with free creatures and not wanting to remove their free will, how much does he interact with to reduce availability to use free will to the point where we just become like basically, baby left and right at this point? That is also not taken into consideration there. So anything else you want to add before we move on?
Nope.
Yeah, I did want to address that because I thought the analogy was well presented. I just don't think it really hits the mark because, again, it doesn't take in those philosophical issues we've already brought up.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
let's move ahead.
This is what I want to point out. 16 verses earlier, you have God telling Moses and Moses telling the people. We see this structure throughout all of the Old Testament. And there are times where in context, you would follow down the chain of command. But whenever it gets to something that Michael Jones cannot say is not immoral, taking these young women, killing young boys, then he has to say, oh, wait a second. Within context, Moses broke the chain of command all of a sudden. God said, do this, and then Moses went off on his own. That's not clear. I'm not saying it's clear the opposite happened. I think that what we're doing is we're putting together evidence.
Okay, but what is wrong with me doing that? Putting together evidence and appealing to the text.
About that.
Like you're complaining the fact that I made a good argument. It sounds like he appealed to what the text said and he used evidence. Dang it! Like, what do you want from me to do? What am I supposed to do?
You're supposed to not interpret the passages correctly, Mike.
Yeah, how dare I like? It's like we can't win. Like it's if we make good arguments or just excuses, it's like whatever.
Moses goes on and carries out those commands. And then we do hear sometimes where Moses does go rogue and then God punishes him. But if we have instances where God commands Moses carries out commands, no punishment, we can infer, I think correctly, that God is at the very least okay with this, which, I do explain there's different positions. There's God.
Okay. Yeah, I know you explain different positions. I think it's irrelevant to the point I want to make here. Yeah, that does not follow that God is okay with it. Like going back to Matthew 19, God gave laws of divorce because your hearts were hard. Not because he was okay with divorce, but because their hearts were hard. God gave Israel a king, 1 Samuel 8, even though he was not okay with that. So it doesn't logically follow that if God allows something, he's okay with that. And that's a philosophical defeater when you're doing an internal critique.
Exactly.
All right, move ahead a little bit here now. Because again, we can't get to literally everything. We're just going to try to hit the main points about that passage is. Let's just say this out. It says, Moses said, this is what the Lord commands. And then notice what the passage ends with. The passage ends with, the Levites did as the Lord commanded. It says the Levites did as Moses commanded. So perhaps the author's even playing with that, saying that maybe Moses is actually exaggerating a command or coming up with a command that God didn't say.
And Christians love the but maybe.
It's even worse than that.
Because philosophers love but maybe. Like,
yes.
That's how philosophy works. You provide defeaters for positions and you show certain things don't necessarily follow. And again, if you're doing an internal critique, we are allowed and justified in offering defeaters. You just can't get mad because we're allowed to do that.
Brandon, Michael Jones has made a very compelling case that this culture was a high context as opposed to ours. Now, just so the listeners understand, because this is almost, it sounds the opposite of it is. A high context society is one in which the text relies on the context and doesn't have a lot of verbose stuff. Our context as modern Americans is low context, meaning we like to list things out. Like look at a law book, it likes to list everything out. So it seems like that would be high context, but no, it's the opposite because we're not relying on context. If you open up the penal code of any state in America, it's going to go 10,000 pages into how to write a parking ticket.
Okay, yeah.
So if we just take Michael Jones at his word that this is high context culture, he can not then turn around and saying, oh, it doesn't specifically say what God told Moses to do. And what is the context of God saying, avenge the people, like go after the Midianite? How would we read that in a high context society? Well, the context is you go wipe out the other guy because your God is bigger than his God and your cause is better than his cause. And those people's sins are evil and your sins are forgiven. That's the context. The context is God is like the president or, the emperor, and Moses is the war lord that's following God's directive. Therefore, God is accountable for the actions of Moses. 100.
Okay, so I'm glad I wanted to play the part of him in talking about the high and low context because that'll come back later in this video. But again, no, that doesn't necessarily follow. Like if God says go and command, like if the president says go and attack the enemy, and they go further and they attack and destroy the village, that doesn't mean the president is responsible because he did not say go and attack the village itself.
Correct.
So, yeah, that doesn't follow. All right, let's get to some super chats here. Anything you want to add before we do that?
No, just saving it for the rest of the video.
Yeah, I think we only got one right now, so we'll do this one, and then we'll get back to big fan of your content question. Are there any apocrypha or pseudepigrapha books you consider recommending reading? Yeah, of course. Read Maccabees, read Judith and Tobit, read the additional chapters of Daniel. I don't see why you wouldn't read the standard apocrypha. Yeah. I like Maccabees a lot. I also think the wisdom of Sirach is interesting, although I think I have some issues with it here and there. But yeah, I'd start with that perhaps. All right. Oops, I hit the wrong thing there. So let me put this back up here. I think I want to move ahead a little bit to where are we at? To 1044 here. So I think we're moving into the Joshua now. Now we addressed a lot of the Joshua stuff earlier on, so keep that in mind. Sorry, I keep hitting the wrong button. So many buttons in StreamYard. Okay, so let's move ahead a little more to some of the Joshua stuff here.
And a lot of what I cover in Joshua, specifically with Jericho, and I talk about how Rahab was rewarded for lying, and they give the example of the Nazis, which is like the most false analogy ever. But I want us to have a conversation, Michael, about
why is it the most false analogy ever? That's a standard. I've seen that analogy so much in philosophical work.
It's the standard analogy in ethical literature.
Yeah, I was like, what? Please explain why that is, because if we're talking about virtue ethics here, why is that a bad analogy? Because I think I did a whole class in one of my seminars when I was getting my master's on that, just that very analogy. The other standard analogy you'll see is the one proposed to Kant, which is if a murderer shows up at your door and politely asks where his family is so you can go kill them, what do you do? And that was a dilemma proposed to the deontologist who said lying is like always wrong. Do you lie to them? And Kant's response was like, you just shut the door and go away. Like you don't have to say anything. And so, I mean, like this
was like one of the biggest self-reports.
Yeah. I actually have a paper here. I'll show, because again, Kant in the lying to the murder of the door. One more time. Kant's legal philosophy and lies to murderers and Nazis. This is standard philosophical stuff, guys. We're not making this up. I swear to you.
No, you're a Christian apologist, so you have to be making stuff up.
Like you're telling on yourself if you don't understand. This is just the basic analogy. All right, let me put the video back up and let's continue on.
Hyperbole. Is there anything you want to say about why this is not a get out of jail free card?
Well, it's very convenient that the apologists can bring up its exaggeration. The text doesn't really mean what it says when they want. It's like playing, as Sam Harris said, tennis without a net.
Okay, then we can just say the opposite to you. You're just making the text say what you want when you want it to. At the end of the day, we're appealing to context. We're appealing to the ancient cultural context. If you're just going to say our arguments are making the text say what we want, we could say the same to you. And we'll get to that later when we get to Elisha.
At this point, you're not doing good history. You're not doing hermeneutics. You're not doing any of this. You're not giving an objection. All you're doing is being a bad armchair psychologist.
Exactly.
If you're going to say the text doesn't really mean what it says, fine. When it says Jesus resurrected, it didn't really mean that. When it says that God loves people, it doesn't really mean that. We can play this game forever. Either the text means what it says in plain language or it doesn't.
Okay. That's a slippery slope fallacy, obviously. And I know I think they either said it earlier in the stream or they're going to say it later that, but this is a Christian fundamentalist mentality. You could have taken that line and put it in a Christian fundamentalist mouth and it would have sounded exactly like it's coming from a Christian fundamentalist. That's what Ken Ham says. You're right. Like it has to mean what it plainly says. And what is it plainly? Like, here's the thing. Here's what I always say to people. Look, I'm not doubting scripture. I'm doubting your interpretation of it.
Exactly.
And there is no plain reading of the text. Everyone interprets the text in certain ways. That's just basic. So again, it's a slippery slope fallacy. That's the way that Christian fundamentalists tend to respond. And again, how we could just say that actually our reading is the plain reading, because it's the plain reading in the cultural context it was written in. You're reading the plain reading through your modern cultural lenses. That's the problem here. So we're actually, if you want to play this game, we're giving you the plain reading because we're trying to read it in its cultural context.
I feel like that's bordering or maybe just straight up denying speech act theory to act like you have to just read your idiosyncratic reading of the text to understand, and that's what it means. Like you're just getting rid of speech act theory at that time, I feel like.
Yeah, and that is very important to apply to the biblical text. If you don't know the philosophy, they shouldn't be doing these critiques then, because there's just a lot of issues where I'm just like, look, if you just knew the basic philosophy surrounding these issues, this wouldn't be an issue. I don't know what to do, man. I'm confused, but all right, let's play another section here. Just wanted to hit that part there. Anything else you want to say on that? Any more notes you wanted to cover?
Nah.
Yeah. All right, let's continue on.
It would be analogous to if one of your children was bullying and hurting and taking advantage of another one of your
So we're talking about David now at this point. So we moved on to this section on David. I want to be clear about that.
children, and you stood back and didn't do anything and then said to later about the story, oh, well, this is just a description of what happened. I'm totally not culpable. So you can't have it both ways. If God knows everything, including the future, and he's aware and present of every action
and willing to intervene.
Exactly. He's willing to intervene at some points. And our argument here is when God is neutral and the text is just explaining things that happen because people were sinful, God does not get to be off the hook unless the argument is God set the world in motion and stood back with the rule, whether self-imposed or from the outside, that he's Thomas Jefferson's deist God. And then he could say, I'm not responsible for that child dying of David and Bathsheba. I'm not responsible for the rapes of David's concubines and wives because I have made a rule or I have a higher power over me that prohibits me from interfering. I think it's
okay. So I'm going to try to steal. I'll try to steel man the argument. So God is being neutral in things means he's somehow, allowing evil to allow to happen. He should be setting outside of it, like from a deist setting and not like interfering at all. Cause what do you have to say about this?
Okay. So this is my interpretation of the argument. They're trying to draw out an inconsistency and say something along the lines of like, look, a God is either going to have to, if a God isn't going to intervene in these instances, then he should intervene in all instances. Otherwise, he can't intervene at all. God intervenes in some of these instances. Therefore, he should intervene in all these instances. He doesn't intervene in all these instances. Therefore, God doesn't exist or God's evil. The problem is when and where God intervenes and should intervene, it goes back to something we already said, is highly debatable in the philosophical literature. You can't just assume when and where he should. Like you're presuming an axiology, and then I can hear them already go, well, I'm just going based off of what your Bible's telling me, which is God's going to intervene, at least scripture tells us, when people are interfering with his plan to bring about the Messiah and eventually the eschaton. But there's no inconsistency there. So I digress.
Yeah. The other thing is Beverly already talked about earlier. He acknowledged the Bible was written in a high context society. Okay. Then you have to acknowledge it's not going to list literally every thought God has. Sometimes things are just narrated in the audience in the high context society knows the response God would have to this. And again, one of the basic aspects of Christian understanding of the Old Testament is to narrate how sinful humanity was and why we needed Christ to come save us. So we should expect to see a lot of that narration happening about this evil's happening with David, this evil's happening with Joshua, this evil is happening here or there, because that fits in with the Christian idea, the Christian theological understanding of the Old Testament, that sin was so rampant. This is all that God could work with. There were no perfect people. Look, we clearly needed God himself to come and save us from that. So if you've already acknowledged the Bible is written in high context society, you kind of just shot yourself in the foot, because then you just can't go to neutral passages and go, yes, see, God is clearly okay with it because he doesn't directly say he's upset here. No, it's a high context society. They're not going to necessarily narrate that. So it kind of is shooting yourself in your foot if you're going to acknowledge that. Anything you want to add before we move on?
Nope.
All right, let's move ahead to the Elijah part, because I think that's going to be more of an interesting aspect. So I think I have the time marker written down here at 11. So this is about Elijah and the two bears. Interesting stuff here. I thought they made some interesting points. Idea of like a bunch of 6 and 7-year-old boys hanging out on the side of the road, making fun of someone's bald head. This is more about cultic competition. They're mocking him for losing Elijah. They're attacking him in terms of like this whole cultic thing because they're devotees of Yahweh and these are devotees of the shrine at Bethel. There's a lot more context going on here. So I think that needs to be taken into consideration if we're going to evaluate this passage here.
I'm going to give a recap because I'm not sure how much of that I'm going to play. IP has a bunch of slides. He's going to throw the kitchen sink at this because it's an issue. And I said, I don't even care if they're little boys or not, because I know that's the kind of apologetic we get. I called it out ahead of time, to which IP at the very beginning says, oh, I'm only calling out all these fundamentalist excuses. He then goes on to make the excuse I called out. And then he's going to come into this. They weren't grizzlies. They were black bears, which aren't as aggressive and can't do as much damage. So how could they have done this? The whole point is that impossible things happened when God's power came on. How could you how could you do anything that is described as a miracle? That's like saying, how could the resurrection have happened? You believe it's a miracle. Do you not believe that this is in the same way God's power miraculously causing 2 animals that otherwise would kill 1 and feed to go and maul 42? Like, when are we bringing in the literal all of a sudden? I have more to say, but Michael, I want to leave a little room for you. Do you have anything you want to add here?
Well, yes, the bears are supernaturally injected to be whatever God wanted. Super bears. So it didn't matter whether they were grizzlies or not. They're
Steroids.
being in
They're huge steroids.
Spiritual steroids.
Well, I mean, let's be honest. This is another Christian fundamentalist principle coming out.
Yes.
This is what we get with Christian fundamentalists. Like when I talked about how, look, if you take a literal reading of the flood account, it would have been naturally impossible for the waters to recede that fast if it was a global flood. What is the response from the Christian fundamentalists? Well, God did it miraculously.
Yep.
When we go to the Jonah account and we say, listen, it wasn't an actual fish. This is a Leviathan for watery chaos. No one can naturally survive in the stomach of a whale. What is the Christian fundamentalist response? God did a miracle. The text does not say God did a miracle there. We're going on what the text actually says and trying to best interpret and understand it. They're inserting miracles in the text to save their interpretation. God had to supernaturally charge the bears to make them attack the 42 children. Young men, whatever you want to say. That's not how it works. That's what you just can't insert miracles into a text to save an interpretation you have here.
Yeah, which I just find ironic at the end of the day.
Yeah, look, we have to, at the end of the day, we have to go on the text and what it actually says. This is something you and I have done when it comes to Jonah. We look at Jonah and we know the modern fundamentalist interpretation. A lot of people have. Jonah was swallowed by a whale. He was in the whale for 3 days, coughed him up. That doesn't make sense with the text because it says he goes down to Sheol. The bars, closed on him forever. He cried out from the realm of the dead. It sounds like he dies. Okay, well then that's what the text is actually saying. And then God brings him back to life. We see also allusions to Leviathan throughout the text. Okay, Leviathan is not a real creature. It's like saying Mother Nature. You're not talking about a real woman. You're talking about the presence of nature itself. Leviathan is just the manifestation or personification of watery chaos. So what is Jonah saying? Jonah is saying that he was swallowed up by watery chaos. He died. God brought him back up out of life. That is the miracle in the text, resurrection or resuscitation, perhaps. It's not that he was kept alive in the belly of the fish because we're going on what the text actually says. We cannot use this Christian fundamentalist hermeneutic where we invent miracles to save the interpretation we want. And in this case, it's to make God evil. What does the text actually say? Young men at this cultic site were mocking Elisha. 2 bears came out. It attacked 42 of them. All right. I don't think the number is literal. Let's just say it is. Okay. How did it get 42? Doesn't say there was a miracle. We cannot insert one into the text when it's convenient for us. I scold Christians on this too. So unless the text talks about a miracle, we shouldn't insert one in there. Doesn't say they were supernaturally charged. It just says 42 bears came out. If they really got 42, it's because the 42 young men decided, teenagers, whatever, decided they were going to defend the Bethel cultic site from these bears, and it didn't work out well because they're bears. That's not making excuses.
No.
That's going on what the text says. Inserting a miracle into the text is the real excuse.
Yeah.
All right. We continue on.
Empowered by God. I mean, they could have been little bumblebees or butterflies.
Yeah.
But it begs the question.
I just picture 42. I would love it. Like you have some text. It's like 2 butterflies came out and mauled 42 men. I was like, what?
Steroid induced butterflies.
That'd be a crazy text. I mean, that would be problematic in my view if that was the case.
If God injected these bears to fight on behalf in a spiritual battle,
where does it say injected? Doesn't say that.
Or because Elisha was carrying the mantle of Elijah, who was carrying the mantle of the Lord. He's a representative of Yahweh. Where were the bears in World War II? Where were the bears in every other war in which Jews or Christians or any innocent party was being attacked by obviously evil parties?
So, Than, why didn't God send bears in World War II?
I actually don't know what to say here.
I mean, it's whataboutism. It's just whataboutism. I mean, they are like expecting God to fill the universe with endless miracles. So like there's no natural law, there's no human response.
Right.
Like, yes, God does do miracles at times when it's important, when he wants to bring about the new covenant in the eschaton. And he can use his foreknowledge to determine when to insert. But miracles are not his go-to standard. We have to remember there was like big gaps in the timeline. Like there's no miracle in between Jacob wrestling with God and Moses. There's no miracles through large parts of the period of Judges, like entire decades. There's no miracles in between like the last prophets and Jesus, for example, or John the Baptist, I guess you could say. I don't think he did any miracles, to be honest, if I'm thinking about it. But that's beside the point. Miracles are reserved for bringing about the plan of salvation. They're not used as a go-to fix for literally everything.
Correct.
And one final note on this: the text doesn't say that 42 killed; it uses the word maul, which can mean like injure or hurt or harm. It doesn't mean they were all killed per se. So something to keep in mind there. Anything you want to add?
No, I like what you said about what miracle, like they're not miracles throughout the Bible and throughout history, I would even argue, are meant to be signs as to who God is. Like Jesus talks about miracles and calls them signs. There's a reason for that. It's not meant to be a fix-all or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. All right, I'm gonna skip ahead to we're gonna get to the Samson section because last time we didn't address it that much because I was like, "What are you serious? Like, God is clearly not in favor of a lot of this stuff Samson is doing." But they wanted to talk about it more, so let's talk about it more.
Justice.
Before we let them share their part in Samson, I'm going to encourage everyone to listen as closely as you can. I think this is where IP drops the ball the most, and I have quite a bit to say
All right, let's hear what you got.
after it. But let's see what they say about Samson.
What is your opinion of Judges?
That's a very broad question. That's a very broad.
The way I have always understood Judges, especially in the commentaries, is this is not a book where God is endorsing all this behavior.
Mhm.
Judges is arranged topologically. You start with the good judges, and you go to the bad judges. It slowly deteriorates. Samson is the last judge mentioned. The implication is he is a really bad judge.
Yeah.
The point of the Samson story is not that God is endorsing Samson's behavior.
Can't God get a good leader? Like he's essentially saying God's empowered this person to do all this evil. And he's not arguing that there's not evil being done, but he's saying somehow God's hands are tied all of a sudden.
Yes, we are.
It's almost like that's the biblical meta narrative in a nutshell, right?
Yes. Yeah. Can God get a good leader? No. Again, we said this last time. I'll say it again. The point of the Old Testament, one of the points of the Old Testament in Christian theology is no, God could not get a leader. Romans 3:23, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. It's one of the main points of Scripture. I mean, like that's supposed to be, I think, a gotcha question. And I was like, what are you talking about? And no, of course God can't get a good leader. Like that's the point.
Maybe it's well, if God can't get a good leader, is he just not smart or not omnipotent? But obviously that doesn't follow. But
yeah, I mean, you could also relate to the stuff you and I have talked about, which is conditional prophecy that we see throughout the Bible. God makes prophecies and literally says, look, if you do evil, I will revoke the good prophecy I gave you. If you do bad, I can send, this is Jeremiah 18. God makes it very clear he has tied prophetic fulfillment on human conditions. So yes, God has tied his hands so he can work with free will and free creatures.
Mm-hmm.
Like this has been the meta narrative, as you said, of the Christian history. Just read the church fathers. They talk about this kind of stuff too.
Right.
Man. It's like, oh. All right, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit more here. Talk a little bit more about Samson. I mean, they're going to play a little bit more of us, but I think we can just summarize that. To fulfill the will you have for me.
Michael makes the exact same statement I do about my third example. And I pointed out it wasn't even for a good reason. And this is where I think it's so damning for IP. He agrees with me. It's for revenge. So why did God's spirit come upon him?
So here we're talking about the spirit of God comes upon Samson so Samson can avenge his eyes. And we said, yeah, that's Samson's a bad guy. He's thinking of his eyes, not of God's glory or helping his people.
That's the prescription I'm talking about. Samson prayed for God to do something that Samson could not do on his own. His strength had already been taken from him at this time. The only way that Samson can do this, which he even shares his motive, his intentions with God, is for revenge for his eyes, not to greater the kingdom. It's simple. And God delivers. What more is a prescription, not a description, than God having to send his spirit down to allow Samson to do this?
All right, so let's talk about that. A little bit of misunderstanding here. God is not saying, yes, revenge is a good thing. God is not saying, again, the whole story of Samson is that Samson is a bad guy. The Philistines are bad guys and oppressors. God uses Samson, aka a Molotov cocktail, to sort of cause chaos in the Philistine world so they stop oppressing his people of Israel. Okay. Samson is going to act the way he does, and God is going to look down on the situation and go, well, if I let him act this way, it's going to cause the chaos for these horrible people. God is not necessarily endorsing it. It goes back to, again, Genesis 50:20. What you meant for evil, God used for good. What Samson meant for revenge, God meant for good because it's freeing Israel. That's not to say he's endorsing literally every thought or motive Samson has.
Correct.
He's using bad situations to bring about a greater good. Anything you want to add to that other than right?
No, and again, the analogy is not perfect, but it's just, again, if you endorse a particular person for office, for instance, does that mean you just approve of everything that they're thinking and doing?
Listen, I have never voted for anyone I like. I'll be honest. Listen, my mentality when I go in the voting booth is, who do I think is going to just do the job better? I'm voting for the lesser of two evils every time.
Yeah, exactly.
And you can apply that kind of to God. God is, look, I'm not happy with this sinful state humanity is in. Who can I throw at these oppressors to bring about a greater good? Yes, God cannot get a good leader. That's the point of the cross. That's the point of Christ coming, because there aren't any good leaders. And so, yeah, we fully acknowledge Samson was a horrible person. There's no Saint Samson churches anywhere. And God is working through bad people to bring about a better world ultimately.
If I was wrong about everything else in the first 2 hours of this video, this completely proves my entire point. We have a God that even by IP's own standards is doing something immoral, getting revenge. It's prescription. His power is coming upon Samson as an answer to prayer to do.
God is not getting revenge. God is allowing Samson to get revenge to cause chaos in the oppressor's camp. I mean, like, where is God prescribing revenge here? He never actually, the text doesn't say that.
Correct.
So, I mean, like, I'm trying to think of another example.
You just have to assume some sort of ethical theory that says that God approves of this. Again, there's just no philosophical argumentation here. There's just gesturing at the data and saying, ha, but like, where's the inference? That's what I'm wanting, is an inference.
Correct. We're lacking that. I mean, you could look at, God in the book of Isaiah anointing Cyrus the Great. Okay, Cyrus the Great wasn't a believer. He also does some bad things. He does some good things, but God is working through imperfect people. That doesn't mean he's approving of all of his actions. That doesn't necessarily logically follow. And I think, honestly, we'll probably just come to an impasse with Beverly and Mindshift here. I don't think we're going to agree on this at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. But again, if you're going to do an internal critique of us, of our view, and we just have to provide philosophical defeaters for that, because you admitted this is an internal critique.
To do this horrific thing. Like, what am I missing here? How is he defending this? Do you have any other thoughts, Michael?
You're not missing a thing. This would be analogous if you knew somebody that wanted to get a revenge on a bunch of other people and you handed him a loaded gun. You're responsible because you know his intent. He's told you his intent. Yeah, so Samson's intent is revenge.
Yeah.
No, this, I wrote this down. No, this is like handing a gun to John Wick and sending him after the mafia. That's what this is. The mafia is bad. John Wick is also not a good guy. But I mean, if the cops are watching John Wick take down the mafia, in some sense, they might be kind of going, okay, well, this is making our job easier. It's making the streets safer. There's a lot less assassins running around oppressing people.
Yeah.
That's what this is. Like, the better analogy is it's sending John Wick after the mafia, or allowing John Wick to go get his revenge on the mafia. And what happens? The mafia collapses. Why would that not be a good thing ultimately? Are you entirely endorsing everything John Wick does? No. You're allowing certain things to happen so that a greater good can come about. And that's perfectly consistent with a virtue ethical framework here. It's like when we have let various Islamic groups fight each other. Okay, we don't agree with what they're doing in the Middle East, but they're creating chaos in their own ranks so they don't, come do terrorist attacks in the West. Like, what do you want us to do? Like, you got to look, these type of things are actually weighed and debated in philosophical literature and ethics. Why can't we apply it to God when the same things are happening? Anything you want to add?
No,
Yeah.
Nothing. That's just not going to be repeating myself.
Yeah, so when it comes to Samson, here's the main point. Let's hit on this because we didn't hit it a lot last time. I was tired by the end of the stream. I was like Samson's a bad dude. We acknowledge that. God does nowhere endorse all his behavior. God sees a means to end oppression. So he throws the Molotov cocktail in. He throws the John Wick in, lets it happen so that the oppression can stop. And that's been church interpretation for a while. This is why Samson is not a saint. Never has been, as far as I'm aware. Maybe in some obscure church, but not in any of the big ones. I mean, trying to think if I know of any Saint Samson church. I can't think of any. But I mean, maybe there is some church that interprets it. I'll grant that, but definitely not in the mainstream.
Yeah.
You know, so yeah, again, in this, but we also, as you would, if you said last time, we don't see any God actually prescribing Samson's behavior. Allowing, yes, to bring about a greater good.
Too much. But this is an objection I get a lot, that I held on to my fundamentalist roots, even as an atheist, that I'm being too literal with the text. But I think I do a pretty good job of showing there's other ways to look at this. Here's what certain groups believe. Here's what certain denominations do. And I feel like what IP and Than are saying here is like what we hear all the time. Listen, someone has an answer for this, therefore it's not legit. That doesn't follow. Like the
Where did we see anything remotely like? That's actually really that's like almost irritating to me, because it's just like, have you just not paying attention? Like, we've never said that.
And also, it just sounds like he's upset we have answers.
Right, exactly.
Like, we're allowed to have answers to this stuff. That doesn't just being mad that we have answers is not a rebuttal to saying the answers are bad. Like, you got to dissect them. Again, this is harder to do in an internal critique. And they brought up Islam earlier. I try to be pretty careful with that. I'm not going to say like Allah is necessarily bad for being a deceiver, because again, in the Islamic worldview, Allah is allowed to be a deceiver because he's not a loving deity. Okay. I try to aim my critiques at things like when he allows child marriage to cause harm and disruption. He allows polygamy, which causes harm and disruption, these kinds of things. So if you're going to do an internal critique of Islam, you got to factor in the fact that, okay, yeah, God is not loving in that world. Now, objectively, I could look on the outside of Islam and go, well, this is not a reason for me to ever want to, be a part of this religion, because I think I have intuitional arguments against it. But I mean, that's another topic.
Yeah.
The judge's excuse. You still have yet to explain to me why God chose to answer Samson's prayer for revenge. Like, how am I reading that as a fundamentalist? We've hopefully done a good job going through example by example of why they...
Well, to be fair, we did bring up earlier examples of the fundamentalist tendency, like inserting miracles to save an interpretation.
Yeah.
That's a fundamentalist principle.
Weren't bad objections, why they're not too literal, why we do understand hyperbole in context, but it still would mean this, or why if you go with that answer, it leads to a conclusion that you still won't like. This feels to me like just, again, kind of throwing a cherry on top, saying none of it was legit anyways.
Yeah, it's a very interesting argument. So Than is basically throwing under the bus all Christians who take things more literally. He's throwing them under the bus and saying, look, those Christians, those arguments are not legit. And he said something interesting to me about scholarship. Critical scholarship acknowledges a lot of stuff that he doesn't want to go. You don't want to go there, Dan, if we're going to go to scholars.
That's interesting. It's the scholarship that they like. It's the Christian scholars who have arrived at the same conclusion. And to me,
Than, are you throwing all those Christians under the bus?
I'm not throwing them under the bus. Am I saying that I think they're wrong? Yes. Is that throwing, if you want to count that as throwing them under the bus, sure. I'm more interested in the fact that this is just a more surprise, with internet YouTube atheism at this point, armchair psychology. Like, again, no objections. You're just kind of foot stomping and saying, hey, he's got positions that he holds to based off the scholarship, and it's just really convenient that he has these scholarly positions that work for him. Like, what are we? I'm not just picking and choosing here. If you look at Mike's channel or my channel, we both go through all the relevant scholarship we can find on all of these topics and give the reasons why we think this particular position is more likely than the other ones. Like, what are we actually complaining about here?
I mean, if you're just complaining we have arguments and you're going to call them excuses, okay, that doesn't mean we're wrong. You can characterize them however you want. That doesn't mean they're wrong. Okay, this is just saying to your audience, this is how we see them. Fine, I don't care how you see them. That doesn't mean they're wrong. All right, I got a couple more sections. I think this is the, last section I want to play, and then we'll get to some super chats.
Yeah.
Context here. Again, we have never argued God doesn't have a right to end a sinful life or a life in general whenever he wants. You got to take that into account. You got to take into account his foreknowledge, planes of existence, these kinds of things. These also apply as well. Since God is on a higher plane of existence, if God wants to end a life and bring him into the next life, he can do that. And you and I both believe in the possibility of postmortem salvation. So given that, if God actually ends a life in this world, it may be out of mercy because he knows he brings him over, he'll repent in the afterlife kind of thing.
If you take this, what Michael Jones is saying, hey, you have to take the whole Christian worldview into context. You have to understand the vision from Eden and whatever your eschatology is to the end. And then that's the only way you can see this. Well, guess what? Now you're playing a game where nobody knows the rules. The game board is whatever you want it to be. And any objection you have, of course, you have an answer to. What I would ask Michael Jones, I would...
You're muted.
Before we get to that question, I want to ask, sorry. What do you mean we're just... that doesn't follow at all. Like, we gave the rules and goals. We talked about the rules and the goals throughout the streams we presented here. That doesn't logically follow that everything is just made up, and that argument Beverly makes is never justified.
It sounds like we're just complaining that your internal critique isn't working.
Right.
Like, that's all it sounds like right here.
Yeah, we're allowed to appeal to things like the plan of God, the rules he set up, the goal of getting to the new covenant and the eschaton and bringing humans through moral progress. I mean, again, you characterize it however you want. That doesn't mean it's a response.
Would say, look, if you find yourself facing Allah, will you change your mind about your criticisms of Islam? Would you say, oh, I was wrong, Islam was just and good all the time? Or
no, I'll get to that in a second.
Would you stick to your guns because you recognize in other religious systems there is a God described that does immoral or malicious or things that aren't logical or fair or they're not just? If you can recognize that, but you exclude your own God based on, well, we just don't know everything and he can see the future and therefore you can excuse anything, that undercuts the idea of there being justice. You're playing with two sets of rules. One set of rules you apply to everybody else's God and religion, and another set of rules you apply to your religion. And if you...
No, for the very simple reason that, once again, Allah is not a loving God. He does not prescribe rules and keeps them based on the fact that he is loving and perfectly morally good. So again, Allah is a father to no one. If I was standing before Allah, my entire metaphysic would have to collapse, because now I have to say that things like, being loving are not necessarily good or part of God's nature, for example. Being, again, I get what Beverly is trying to do here, but you got to understand the way Islam actually is comparable to Christianity. And I'm talking mostly about the Sunni traditions. I think there are some Ismaili traditions that are a little different per se, but like, again, I have never said, for example, that it is wrong for Allah to end a life or punish sin if he sees fit. That has never been the argument I've made. My arguments have been against God, Allah allowing Muhammad to do demonstrably evil things if he's supposed to be the moral standard for humanity, which they say. There's where the problem lies. And again, the moral standard for humanity is Jesus, and Jesus was sinless. He is not doing the things like child marriage or polygamy that we see that are so bad. But again, if I'm standing before Allah, my entire metaphysics needs to collapse, because I cannot say things like things are good based on God's nature now. What even is good at that point? It's really go ahead.
I was going to clear something up on the off chance somebody's misunderstanding this. Because when you're saying Allah is not a loving God, you're not making a value judgment there. You're using Islamic theology, because Muslims will tell you, no, like, Allah is not primarily love. He is whatever else they'll say. So like, it's not, you're not making a value judgment. You're taking actually the internal content of Islam and saying Islam doesn't even say this.
Mm-hmm. And this is not special pleading, guys, because you're doing an internal critique of Christianity, you've got to do this. You have to apply that same standard to what the internal features are of Islam. Okay. That's just the basic facts of it. So no, this is not special pleading, for example.
Yeah.
All right, last section I want to play out here.
And if you want to live that way, that's fine. But then how can you dare accuse the Muslims, the Mormons, the Hindus, the Seventh-day Adventists, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Catholics, Calvinists, or any other religion of being wrong or doing anything wrong? Because they can say the same thing. Our God told us this is the truth. Therefore, everything that we do or say is true. End of story.
Perfect.
Okay, so he used the word true there, and it threw me off because I think he was trying to say moral. Because, like, look, if it's true that Allah is not loving, okay, then how can I even judge that, like, what he is doing is wrong? Because there is no actual standards that he has set up that he would have to hold himself to. So again, it's an entirely different worldview. The internal critiques that you are applying to Christianity cannot be applied in Islam because, again, he's not a loving God. I don't see how this follows at all.
Right. And again, this just sounds like we're just doing armchair psychology again. Like, because again, we are giving our, like, the whole, who are you to say this and this and this? We're a human being that's interested in debating on what's true and what's not true.
Yeah.
Like, if you're going to try to make a judgment call and paint us as hypocrites or something like that for saying you're wrong but we're right, you're doing the exact same thing. Like,
Beverly, I don't think you're getting it. No. What if Allah is God, then whatever he says is love? No, because they don't think Allah is love. Love is not like the basis good value. They focus more on order, structure, and power. Love is something else. It's not. I remember talking to a Muslim one time, and he said basically that, no, Allah does not love us. Allah is not, love is not necessarily central aspect has with it.
I have had for like, I have an argument, I have an a priori argument for if a God exists, that this God would be Trinitarian. It's an argument from love itself. And one of the objections I get constantly from Muslims when I give this argument is that they think a God is not going to be essentially loving. Like, I've had Muslims make objections to a love argument for the Trinity by denying that love is an essential property of God. So it's like this is Islamic theology. It's not us making a value judgment. Yeah.
And, again, Allah is the best of deceivers. He could literally deceive all the Muslims. I think Muhammad even said he didn't even know, I believe it's in the Hadiths, he said he didn't even know if he was going to get into paradise because, you can't make these kind of judgment calls for Allah. He's the best of deceivers. He can change his will whenever he wants, kind of thing. So it's not the same worldview. It's not the same kind of internal critique. If Islam is true, you're going to get more of like a nihilistic picture, almost more of like a subjective, you're not going to get like objective morality. You're going to get more of like a moral subjectivist picture in some sense, because a lot of this is just on the whims of whatever the creator wanted, who is not bound by his nature, as William Lane Craig says, to be morally good, be just, be loving, these kinds of things. So this kind of thing does not follow. It's not special pleading for those very reasons. So, all right, you want to get to some super chats here? I guess that's a yes. Okay.
Oh, I didn't know that was a question. Sorry.
Okay, Christians struggling with Gilgamesh similarities in Genesis, the serpent in the tree in the story in particular. Seen your flood similarity video. Okay, did you see the other one I did? Let me see if I can pull it up here. So I did 2 videos on this. So I'm trying to remember the name of it off the top of my head. I've done so many now, it's hard to really keep up.
I can try to find it if you want.
Oh, it's was Genesis taken from pagan legends?
Oh,
Did Genesis plagiarize from pagan legends is in the thumbnail. I go through Genesis 2 and 3 and show, no, this is very unlikely. So yeah, I know what you mean. So yeah, I did the one on the flood accounts in Gilgamesh, but I also did another one, was Genesis taken from pagan legends? Check out that one. That one will probably help you out with that one. IP, don't you know that whenever Brandon says all day, as busy as a bee, it's just a scratch, all hands on deck. He's being completely literal. Got him.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
Man, I wish I had that meme I could play. Yeah.
With like the SWAT team coming out of nowhere and everything.
Yeah. I mean, this is what we talked about earlier with speech act theory. That needs to be applied to the Bible like we would apply to any other psychological aspect, worldview kind of thing. So if Brandon says, I saw the sunrise this morning. I'm like, oh, you think the sun moves around the earth? You think it rises in the sky? Don't you know the earth goes around the sun? No, I understand speech act theory. I understand what he's saying. It's saying
Right.
We can apply that to God, same kind of aspects. Thank you for your super chat, Ross. Much appreciated. And then you get your actual joining in from night shift. Just wanted to say ... flag. Which flag is that one?
It's not even showing a flag for me. It's
You pathetic. You and your
it's
computer.
like an IE on my end.
All right. So
Somebody said Ireland.
I was about to say, I was thinking either Ireland or Cote d'Ivoire or India. It was like it's got to be one of those three. But because some of the flags, it's like they have the same colors and they're just reversed or something. Like the Dutch and the French flag is like the same one, just like turned on its side. Always annoyed by that. And they're like right next to each other of all places. What are they thinking? Oh, thank you for gifting 10 memberships.
Wow.
I always wonder who this goes to. A couple like weeks ago.
It says it in a chat if you look.
Oh, okay. A couple weeks ago, like I had like 40 members just drop off. And it was because like AP was on my channel and he like started gifting people memberships. I was like, and then all of a sudden they disappeared. I was like, oh, right. AP gave all those memberships and they just went away. So appreciate the gifting more. So then that might be bumped up a little bit more. So, all right, Than, what do you got coming up on your channel?
On my channel, I have a long video coming out. It's the last entry on my Mark in the Chaos Conf series.
Did you say Mein Kampf?
Mark's gospel.
I know. The way you said it made me go, whoa.
Man, I got a lot of stuff coming up. I'm gonna make a video. Oh, go ahead.
Mind your business, Jesse. I just said they were close by, or maybe I said they were next to each other. But
I have a video coming up.
Jesse, apply speech act theory to what I said. Jeez.
Maybe I'll make a video on speech act theory.
Yeah, I did one a while ago. I did one like Ancient Cosmos, I think is the title of it. Applying it to the biblical description of the cosmos. So I did one on that a while ago.
Yeah, I got lots of fun stuff coming up though. So
yeah, I have a video coming out tomorrow on the temple cleansing. John says it happened early in Jesus' ministry.
Ooh,
what do you think I'm going to argue, Than?
I'm going to get my hopes up and say that you're going to argue that the temple is cleansed twice.
Correct. Yeah. I used to think it was one and John moved it, and then I was reading more and I'm like, you know what? I think the evidence favors that.
Yeah.
Michael has a question for you.
Than has me planned at some point. Yeah, I saw your email, Michael. Like I said, for the audience, Michael and I were going to go live here and this month, but it's my wife's busy season, so my work hours are condensed to like 4 days. So it's rough right now.
Yeah, we're still trying to expand the ministry so I can eventually hire Than, but that we're waiting on some things to actually happen on some other people's end. So yeah, things are in motion. IP, love your work. Honestly, a massive fan. What do you think about God being everyone? Does that include hell as well? Also need book recommendations. I'm not a pantheist.
Yeah, that's how I interpreted that too.
What do you think about God being everyone? Well, he isn't. Do you want to clarify perhaps? What? I don't think God is everyone. So do you think maybe he meant everywhere? God being everywhere. Because in the next question, does that include hell, which is a place? Maybe he meant everywhere. So I think the scriptures say God is everywhere. God is omnipresent. Maybe. So like one of the Psalms refers to him being everywhere. So yeah, I think that's what he's referring to. So yeah, I would say God is everywhere. Then my next video is mine.
Sub to my OnlyFans.
Yeah. Thank you for the clarification. Yeah. Yeah, I would say God is everywhere. His spirit is omnipresent.
He asked about hell then too. So
yeah, I think one of the Psalms says, even if I go down to the depths of Sheol, you are there. So I think that God is omnipresent even there. So yeah, we can't escape God. And that relates even to our view of hell. Like I said in my video, does God send people to hell? That everyone goes to the same fire. For those who embrace God and love God, it is beautiful and rejoicing. For those who reject God, it is the fire that burns them, the fire of God's love. They reject God's love, therefore, and they want to be their own kings, their own gods. That is a disintegrating fire, because the fire of God calls us to be humble, humiliate, and to bring us to humility is what I'm trying to say. And if that's the case, if we're rejecting that because we reject God, it could be a fire of pain in that sense. So we create our own hell by rejecting God is the argument I make in that video. So, all right, final thoughts on the whole mind shift Beverly response.
I'm looking forward to their 5-hour response to us.
Yeah. I don't know if we'll do another one. My mentality is like, I tend to do the 2-strike mentality. Yeah. All right. You made an argument. We'll respond. I'll give you a chance to clarify. If it wasn't that good, I'm going to move on. Like,
we have other things to respond to.
Yeah. Listen, from what we saw on the stream, there's a lot of reading that needs to be done, especially when it comes to the philosophy. If you're going to say things in your own stream, like if God has different rules, then morality is subjective, not objective, to paraphrase Mind Shift. You need to read up on meta ethics and what we mean by moral realism. If you're going to say Galatians means that Paul is saying that some people are loved less, you got to actually read what Galatians says, because that's blatantly taking it out of context. Yeah. You're going to say that Abraham didn't have a culture he was in. What? Like, no, that's just a bad argument all the way around. I mean, like, if you want to make the argument that Christianity causes war, please read up on the literature, like The Myth of Religious Violence. That is a standard book you need to read if you want to argue religion causes violence. You cannot make that argument without at least consulting that book or acknowledging that book.
Yeah. And we don't mean that in like a degrading way either.
No.
Like, there's just a lot lacking in the stream. That was my, I mean, like I said, I wanted to see inferences, and there was tons of places where we had a observation and a conclusion, but no inference that connected the two. So
yeah, and so that's where we're at, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, if this is an internal critique, this is not a good way to show God is actually evil and that there's a problem, because of the issues we listed, the philosophical, theological, textual issues. Our main points are going to be, I would say, philosophical. Yeah, because you're not including all of God's ontology, these kinds of things, and making those. And again, one final thing I want to note is we did not say that Brandon did not provide prescriptions, because that was a point he brought up a lot of times. We agreed that he did. We just would argue that, when he prescribed Hagar being sent away, that wasn't necessarily an evil prescription. So we covered that a lot. All right. Don't forget here, all that I'm saying is final word. We don't believe God is evil. We all seem to forget that. Great. Your final word. You're right. Again, we're that's why we're focusing on this being an internal critique. So, all right. Close out the stream. Thanks for coming, everyone. I will be next week on Ruslan's channel. I'm going to go out for that. So probably in 2 weeks, I'm going to try to do some streams. Oh yeah, should be good. Final super chat with Elijah and the two bears. It is possible the bears coming against the kids while mocking was a coincidence and was perceived as God sending them. I guess maybe. I wouldn't lean in that direction, though. No. I don't know about you, Tham.
No, I just haven't looked into the particular story enough to have a strong opinion on it. So,
yeah. All right, guys. I'll see you in 2 weeks. I'll do a stream then, maybe 2, depending on what time I have to get to.